One girl 2 stations down got precognitive reflex, and the proctor actually clapped. I'd been standing at station 11 for 6 minutes with a relic on a velvet cushion, and the proctor had stopped pretending she still believed in me somewhere around minute 4. She told me to get on with it, whenever I was ready. The dagger was called the Founder's Verdict, supposedly the first weapon ever pulled out of the first dungeon this city ever cracked open, or so the placard under the cushion claimed. Older than the guild itself, priceless in the way things stop being about money and start being about paperwork, if the story on the placard was even true. My whole affinity test came down to one instruction: channel your ability into the test object, see what the system logs. I channeled. I don't know how. Nobody ever taught me how. You just sort of reach for the thing under your ribs and push, the same way you'd reach for a word on the tip of your tongue, and hope your body knows what your brain doesn't. Gone, sparkling apart into nothing over a 900-year-old velvet cushion, like it had never agreed to exist in the first place. For one full second, nobody in that hall breathed. Liquidated. Founder's Verdict. Ceremonial relic to +1 bronze. Whatever I'd just done to 900 alleged years of guild history, my file now had a category for it, and the category was unknown, catastrophic, non-combat, which is a hell of a thing to see about yourself at 9 in the morning. Arguing costs energy I didn't have, and I'd already spent my whole month's worth of surprises on one cushion. They didn't expel me. The guild doesn't turn away a warm body, not with the labor shortage down in sanitation. They just reassign me. Effective immediately. Waste disposal, Neo Seoul Central District, corpse and debris clearance. Cleared dungeons only, 6 a.m. Shifts. Pay so far below the licensing minimum, I checked twice to make sure the number wasn't a typo. It was not a typo. I want to say I had some kind of dignified reaction to any of this. I didn't. I signed the transfer form, thanked a woman who was actively deciding not to be my friend, and went home to my one-room apartment to do rent math with a calculator I'd owned since middle school, because some things never change no matter how many national treasures you accidentally erase before lunch. Rent was due in 11 days. Sanitation pay, once it finally landed, was going to cover about 60% of it, which meant 11 days to figure out where the other 40% was coming from, same as every month since I'd moved to this city. I got handed a pair of gloves that had clearly disposed of someone else's problems for years before mine, a cart with one bad wheel, and a supervisor named Bay, who looked at my file for exactly 2 seconds before deciding I wasn't worth being cruel to. Bag it, cart it, don't touch anything still twitching, she said. You'll live longer that way. I believed her. I bagged. I carted. Nothing twitched, which I counted as a personal victory. It was slow, filthy, forgettable work. Cold stone, standing water, the particular smell of a floor that had hosted a fight 3 days ago and hadn't been aired out since. And somewhere around hour 4, bored out of my mind and hauling my 9th broken gauntlet of the morning toward the cart, I did the thing everyone does when they're bored and miserable and trying not to think about their life. I pulled up my own status window, mostly to see if staring at my own uselessness in a different font would somehow feel better. Level 1. Strength 1. Every stat that mattered sitting at the floor. Exactly what I expected. Then I got to the currency line, and I stopped walking. Bronze 1. I hadn't been paid. I hadn't done anything all morning except bag garbage and not get eaten. That had happened 2 days ago, in a different building, in front of 6 evaluators who would absolutely have said something if my broken little affinity had quietly generated a single bronze piece out of destroying the most expensive object in the room. I looked down at the gauntlet still in my hand, cracked plate, dead mana core, worth nothing to anyone, headed for the scrap pile same as everything else in my cart that morning, and mostly because I had nothing left to lose and a very stupid theory to test, I reached for the same thing under my ribs I'd reached for at Station 11. I pushed. Liquidated. cracked iron gauntlet to +2 bronze. The gauntlet went warm, then weightless, then it just wasn't in my hand anymore, and the little blue panel opened again, patient as ever, like it had been waiting 2 whole days for me to finally notice it existed. 2 bronze wasn't a fortune. 2 bronze was barely a rounding error. But 2 bronze that shouldn't exist is a different kind of number than 2 bronze you earned, and I spent the rest of that first shift finding out exactly how not a fluke it was. I liquidated everything. Cracked helmets, snapped bowstrings, a boot with no foot-shaped owner anywhere nearby that I chose not to think too hard about. Every single piece of garbage in that cart caught the same warm, weightless pull under my ribs, then vanished, and every single time the panel opened and told me what it was worth. Most of it wasn't worth much. A stripped bolt earned me nothing at all. The panel didn't even bother opening, which told me something too, filed away for later. A shattered lantern core, on the other hand, paid out enough that I stood there blinking at the number for a solid 10 seconds. I tried a rusted-through breastplate next, half expecting nothing since it still technically counted as armor, and got a payout anyway. Apparently still counting as armor and being broken enough to liquidate weren't mutually exclusive, which told me the rule cared less about what a thing used to be and more about whether anyone still wanted it. I tried a monster husk some earlier crew had left curled in a corner, already 3 days gone and smelling like it. And that one paid out best of all. More than the helmet, more than the lantern core, enough that I had to sit with the number for a second before I believed it. Whatever counted as dead to this thing, it counted generously. By the end of that first shift, I had 6 bronze and a working theory. Dead counted, broken counted, unwanted counted. I tried it, once, on a drop glove that still had a hand-shaped dent in it, and looked perfectly serviceable. Nothing. No panel. No pull under my ribs. Just a glove, sitting in my palm, refusing to become money. Whatever this was, it wasn't magic that ate things indiscriminately. It had opinions. 6 bronze wasn't going to fix my rent problem. But it was 6 more than the 3 I'd walked in with, and after a week of being told, in 6 different tones, that I was worth nothing to anyone, I found I didn't hate having a number that only went up. Something in my legs agreed with me, too. In a way I didn't clock until I was hauling my last cart of the day and realized it wasn't hurting as much as it should have. I pulled the status window up out of habit, mostly to check the bronze count again, and found the rest of it had moved too. Level, 1 to 2. Strength, 1 to 2, vitality, 1 to 2, perception, 1 to 2, 1 point in everything. Not much. I could still feel every single one of those 100 bins a shift put on my spine, but it was there, plain as the bronze count, and it hadn't cost me anything I remembered spending. Apparently corpse hauling builds something, eventually, in anyone who does enough of it, cheat or no cheat. I filed it next to the stripped bolt and kept working. The rest of the week went the same way. 6 a.m. shifts. Bagging, carting, liquidating anything that qualified and getting quietly turned down by anything that didn't. Bae wasn't one of them. Bae mostly stood near the entrance with a thermos, reading something on a cracked tablet, and only looked up when something needed her actual attention. Rent was still due in 5 days, then 4, then 3, counting down whether I paid attention to it or not. 6 bronze, then 8, then 10 wasn't going to move that number in any direction that mattered. Sanitation pay was going to cover what it covered, and I was still going to be short, same as every month, but I noticed I'd started doing a second, smaller piece of math alongside the rent math. It was just nice, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, to have a number worth doing math about it all. Wednesday, I found out the theory had edges I hadn't mapped yet. A cracked wand, dead core, no charge left in it anywhere I could sense, liquidated clean, decent payout. A second wand, same make, same crack pattern, sitting right next to it, nothing, no panel. I turned it over twice looking for whatever made it different from its twin before I gave up and just bagged it instead. Some broken things apparently weren't broken enough, or were broken in the wrong way, or the whole system ran on rules I hadn't earned yet. I added it to the list of things to figure out later and moved on. There was always more cart to fill. Thursday, it was a dead familiar, some hunter's contracted lizard thing, expired mid-contract and left behind because dragging a corpse familiar out yourself apparently wasn't in anyone's job description but mine. It paid out almost nothing, which surprised me until I noticed the collar was still active, still technically bound to an owner somewhere, still technically somebody's property, even dead. Not fully unwanted, not fully mine to claim. I filed that under edges too, and dragged it to the cart the old-fashioned way instead, muscle and cartwheel, no shortcuts. I dropped a full bag 2 inches from Bay's boots that same afternoon and swore at it loud enough that she looked up from her tablet just to tell me, flat, that wasn't very human garbage disposal of me. I didn't have a comeback. She wasn't wrong, and she'd gone back to her reading before I came up with one anyway. The second time she looked up all week was at the end of my 6th shift, when I was standing by the exit trying to convince my spine that the walk home was worth the trouble, and she held out half a pair. I stared at it for a second too long. Nobody at that guild had handed me anything that wasn't a form or a bad review in over a week. "You look like you're about to fall over," she said, like that explained it, which, fair, it kind of did. Eat something with an actual vitamin in it for once. I took it. It was better than anything I'd eaten in days, and I told her so, and she made a noise that wasn't quite a laugh and went back to her tablet without another word. I didn't push it. I ate the rest of it on the walk to the transit stop, 12 bronze in my account where 3 had been a week ago, and thought that maybe this wasn't the worst place they could have thrown me after all. I filed that under kindness I hadn't earned and wasn't going to question, right next to the wand that wouldn't liquidate and the familiar still wearing someone else's collar. 18 whole bronze in, I'd started thinking of myself as something of a professional. That should have been my first warning, because nothing about 6 days of hauling corpses actually qualifies a person for anything except a stronger stomach and a worse sense of smell. The job that morning was a low-tier clearance zone 2 floors down. A packed in, hunters swept through the night before, kill count logged, all clear stamped on the manifest I never actually got to read before they handed me the cart. Standard sweep. In and out, bag the leftovers. Don't ask questions about the ones that still had a face. Packed ins were the worst assignment in rotation, and everybody knew it. Goblins nested in numbers, which meant a lot of small, ugly, low-value bodies instead of the occasional high-payout husk, which meant a full cart for a fraction of the bronze a single big kill would have earned me. I'd resigned myself to a long, unglamorous morning of small numbers before I'd even gotten off the lift. Rent was 5 days closer than it had been the week before, which was its own kind of unglamorous math, and I was doing it badly in my head instead of paying attention to the ground in front of me, which in hindsight was the actual mistake, not the reflex that came after it. The den itself was worse than usual, too, though I didn't clock that as a warning sign until much later. Goblin nests always left more rubble than a fight should reasonably produce. Collapsed support beams, half a dozen crude little lean-tos knocked flat, debris piled deep enough in places that a cart wheel would just stop dead against it. Hunters cleared the kill count and moved on to better assignments. Nobody on that squad got paid extra to double-check every shadow in a pile of debris that deep, and I understood that too, the same way I understood everything else about being at the bottom of a very long list of priorities. I was 3 carts deep and working on autopilot when something in the rubble ahead of me twitched. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it wasn't bravery and it wasn't stupidity, it was worse than both. It was habit. 6 days of reaching for that tug behind my sternum on anything that looked broken enough had turned into a reflex faster than my actual thinking, and my actual thinking hadn't caught up yet to the fact that the thing twitching in the rubble was a goblin, and the goblin was not dead, and the manifest that said all clear had apparently missed one. Nothing but a live, furious, 6 days hungrier than me goblin looking directly at the idiot who'd just tried to erase it from existence with his mind. I'd mapped the edges of that rule all week on things that couldn't hit back. I found out what it actually cost to test it on something that could in about half a second, which is roughly how long it took the goblin to close the distance and take a piece of my left hand with it. I'm not going to describe the next part in loving detail, mostly because most of it happened too fast for me to actually watch. I remember the cart going up sideways as a shield, because it was the only thing in reach that wasn't my own body. I remember the specific, unglamorous sound 6 days of gear rot makes when a goblin's claws go through it instead of me. I remember shouting something that wasn't a plan so much as a very loud noise, on the theory that loud noises occasionally work on things without complex feelings, and I remember it not working even a little. I remember the goblin getting a hand around the cart's edge and yanking it sideways like it weighed nothing, which it apparently didn't to something that size and that angry, and I remember the half-second of nothing between the cart going and my brain catching up to the fact that I no longer had anything between us. A sanitation worker doesn't train for this. I don't carry anything sharper than a bag clip. I've never swung at anything that could swing back, and I survived that fight purely on the strength of not being worth chasing very far once better options showed up, because that's the part that actually saved me, not any instinct of my own. A real hunter, close enough behind the original sweep to hear the noise, finally caught up. The goblin went down for good under someone else's blade while I was still working out which direction was up. I got the small, extremely satisfying consolation prize of liquidating it properly afterward. Once it was actually dead, turns out dead for real still counted just fine, small mercies, but by the time it was over I was sitting against a wall missing most of my ring finger, ears ringing, doing my best not to look directly at the space where it used to be. Nobody rushed over with a healer's kit. That kind of courtesy went to the hunter who'd actually done the killing, not the sanitation worker who'd caused the problem in the first place, and I understood the logic even while I was busy resenting it. I got a strip of field gauze someone tossed me without breaking stride. I'll walk it off, you're not dying. That was more hope than diagnosis, and about 40 minutes left on a shift, I still had to finish one-handed. Level 2 to 3. Strength 2 to 3. Vitality 2 to 3. Perception 2 to 3. I noticed the climb almost as an afterthought, wrapping gauze around what used to be a full finger with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. Whatever this week of hauling and nearly dying was doing to me, it was doing it a little more with every close call, same as it had with every shift. Small comfort, held up against a hand that wasn't going to look right again. Without help, I didn't have the first idea how to get. I checked my status window once the gauze held, mostly to confirm my bronze count hadn't somehow gone backward out of spite. Bronze, 18. 18 bronze, for fingers and a thumb held together with someone else's spare gauze, and a working, hard-earned, personally tested rule that I was never again going to reach for anything that looked back at me first. What to actually do about the finger, whether walk it off was going to hold until end of shift, whether I could afford whatever a real healer charged for something the guild wasn't going to cover, was a problem I hadn't solved yet, and it wasn't going to solve. There was, of course, paperwork. There is always paperwork. The incident form the guild required for any on-site injury had a box for equipment failure, a box for hostile contact unlocked, a box for supervisor notified, and a box. I checked twice, genuinely labeled morale impact, solve itself while I finished the clearance zone one-handed and behind schedule, cart while squeaking the whole way back. There was, of course, paperwork. There is always paperwork. Self-reported, scale of 1 to 5, which felt like an insane thing to be asked while actively bleeding through gauze. Supervisor Bay signed off on it without asking a single question I didn't want to answer, glanced once at the gauze, and told me to see someone about that before it got infected, which was excellent advice I had no immediate way of following. Rent math and finger math turned out to be surprisingly similar shapes of problem. Both came down to a number I didn't have and a deadline I didn't get to negotiate, and by the time I locked up my apartment door behind me, I was already soaking through at the edges again. I still hadn't landed on an answer for either one. The guild's medical wing had a waiting room with two very different lines in it, and I found out exactly which one I belonged to about 4 whole seconds after I walked in. Line 1. Hunters, ranked, badges out, waved straight through a set of double doors by a clerk with an actual smile on. Line 2. Everyone else. I joined everyone else, took a numbered ticket out of a dispenser that looked older than the building, and sat down next to a man holding what used to be his own ear in a napkin. Somewhere further down the row, someone was nursing a hand that had gone a color hands aren't supposed to go. Further still, someone whose injury I honestly couldn't identify sat very still, staring at the wall. Nobody said anything worth repeating, myself included. The board above the desk cycled through estimated wait times by rank, and mine, sanitation, unranked, filed somewhere under civilian support staff, wasn't a number at all. It was a dash. I asked the clerk how long a dash usually took. She said it depended how the day went for everyone ahead of me, and that I was welcome to wait as long as I needed to. I did the math on that answer and didn't love it. My gauze had soaked through twice on the walk over, and the finger under it had gone from throbbing to a duller, worse kind of quiet that I was fairly sure meant something I didn't want it to mean. I asked if there was any faster option at all, on the off chance the clerk knew something the board didn't say out loud. She just repeated the same line about the day going how it went, in the exact same flat tone, and I got the distinct sense she'd said those exact words to a great many people before me, none of whom had liked the answer any better than I did. The waiting room filled and emptied around me in a rhythm that had nothing to do with how long anyone had actually been sitting there. A classy hunter walked in 40 minutes after me with a dislocated shoulder, gave her badge number, and was through the double doors before she'd finished sitting down. Nobody in line 2 so much as looked up. I was apparently the only person in the room who hadn't had time yet to get used to it. I sat with that answer for about 40 minutes, watching the dispenser hand out tickets nobody in line 2 seemed to expect would ever actually get called, before I noticed the bin. One piece near the bottom was worth more than the rest of the bin combined. A fist-sized healing core, cracked clean through, and the panel it produced made me sit up straight enough that the man with the ear glanced over. Liquidated, fractured greater healing core to +9 bronze. 9, plus what the rest of the bin scraped together, put my total somewhere I hadn't expected to be that morning. Bronze, 28. 28 from a hazardous waste bin, in a waiting room, while I still had a dash next to my name. I was still doing the math on that when a name that wasn't mine got called, and a face I recognized ducked out from a side door to call it. Yuna, in a cleaner robe than the one I'd seen her in 2 days ago, and considerably more surprised to see me sitting in the civilian line with my hand wrapped in gauze that had clearly seen better days than this. She took one look at the gauze and didn't bother hiding what she thought of it. It had gotten infected, she said, flatly, and I told her, in my defense, that I'd technically been looked at, briefly, by a man whose entire medical opinion was walk it off. She wasn't impressed by my defense. The line I was in wasn't going anywhere fast, she said, glancing at the board and at the dash next to my name. There was a paid line too, flat rate, no rank required at all, just money, which the guild generally assumed someone in civilian support never had enough of to bother offering. She named the number and winced on my behalf. 28 bronze against a flat rate I'd never once expected to be able to afford by rank was, for possibly the first time since I'd destroyed a national treasure for pocket change, actually enough, with a little left over. I told her so, and watched the surprise on her face land somewhere between skepticism and genuine relief. She checked the number twice, which I didn't blame her for, then walked me past the dash and the waiting room, and the two very different lines, straight through the same double doors the ranked hunters used, into a small clean room that smelled like antiseptic instead of dungeon. It was the first genuinely quiet room I'd been in all week. No rubble, no rot, no cartwheel squeaking somewhere behind me, no board on the wall counting down anyone's worth by rank, and I noticed, sitting in it, how much of my last 7 days had happened in places actively trying to kill or humiliate me, sometimes both in the same afternoon. My finger, properly looked at under real light, turned out to be exactly as bad as her face had suggested it would be. She fixed it anyway, closed, clean, still shorter than it used to be, since full regrowth was still above her rating, but real, competent medicine instead of a stranger's gauze and a bad guess. She gave the exact same treatment either way, rank or no rank. She told me partway through, focused on the work rather than on me, which made the admission a good deal easier for both of us. It was, apparently, one of a dozen small mercies buried deep in the fine print of guild policy that nobody at her level was ever actively encouraged to advertise, and most of the people who genuinely could have used it never stayed in the waiting room long enough to ever hear about it from a healer at all. I thanked her when she finished, and meant it more than I'd meant anything I'd said all week. She fixed it anyway, closed, clean, still shorter than it used to be, since full regrowth was still above her rating, but real, competent medicine instead of a stranger's gauze and a bad guess. She gave the exact same treatment either way, rank or no rank. She told me partway through, focused on the work rather than on me, which made the admission a good deal easier for both of us. I walked out past the dash on the board and past the man still holding his ear, past the whole line of numbered tickets that were never going to matter to me again, 28 bronze poorer in the ledger, and stopped dead just outside the double doors. Money walked straight past the queue, the rating, and the dash next to my name. No permission required from anyone at all, and no clerk was ever going to volunteer that fact to someone she assumed. Rank had never actually gated the treatment. It had only ever gated the free version of it. Couldn't possibly use it. And if that was true here, in a building that existed specifically to sort people by rank, I wanted to know exactly what else in this city ran on the same quiet rule. I spent the next 4 full days doing what I was apparently good at now, which was hauling other people's garbage and quietly turning it into money absolutely nobody at that guild knew I had. Nothing dramatic happened, not once. No fractured healing cores, no lucky bins tucked behind a reception desk, just the same grind as always, card after card, liquidating whatever qualified and getting nowhere at all with whatever didn't. 15 bronze by the end of it, 1 or 2 pieces at a time, the kind of number that would have felt genuinely enormous to me 2 weeks ago, and now just felt like an ordinary Tuesday. Level, 3 to 4. Strength, 3 to 4. Vitality, 3 to 4. Perception, 3 to 4. Bronze, 43. I hadn't touched a single piece of the 43 since the clinic. I kept meaning to, and kept not finding anything worth spending it on, until I remembered the thing Yuna had let slip in that treatment room without quite meaning to say it out loud, that she was only cleared for what her current tier let her be cleared for, and full regrowth sat somewhere well past it. I asked around, carefully, the way you ask about something you don't want anyone connecting back to you. Not Yuna herself. I didn't have a reason to be talking to her again, yet that wouldn't have looked strange, and showing up unannounced to ask a healer about her own career prospects felt like exactly the kind of thing that gets a person a very awkward conversation. The sanitation crew heard everything eventually, though, gossip traveling sideways through the guild the way water finds every crack in old pipe, seeping into rooms it was never meant to reach. A healer's rating didn't move on its own, apparently. It moved on continuing education, on hours logged, and above all on training materials the guild expected every single healer to buy for themselves, out of wages that never left much room left over for buying anything at all. One of the older hands on my crew, who'd apparently dated a healer once and never quite gotten over the guilt of watching her scrape by, told me the going rate for a real advancement course without me even asking directly. I filed the exact number away carefully and didn't ask any more questions than that single one. I found the manual at a supply shop 2 transit stops from the medical wing, on my one day off, still smelling faintly of the week's work no matter how long I'd spent scrubbing in a sink that never fully got warm. The shop itself served healers and healers in training exclusively, glass cases of reagents I didn't recognize, a wall of manuals sorted by discipline and rating, a clerk behind the counter who'd clearly stopped being surprised by any particular customer years ago. I asked for the advancement course by its exact full name, the title the older hand on my crew had given me, and the clerk pulled it without comment. A proper course, the kind that actually moved a rating instead of just padding a resume, priced high enough that I understood immediately why a support healer attached to whichever party needed her that week had never gotten around to affording one. 35 whole bronze, flat rate, absolutely no haggling room, more money than I'd have ever believed I could casually hand over 2 weeks ago without flinching. I didn't flinch, not even once. I bought it anyway, in cash, under no name at all, because the clerk never asked for one and I certainly wasn't about to volunteer it myself. Bronze, 8. 8 left. I genuinely couldn't decide, walking out of that shop, whether I'd just done the most reckless thing I'd ever done with money or the first thing worth doing with it. Getting it to her, without my name on it, took more thought than buying it had. I couldn't exactly walk into the medical wing and hand a stranger a package. The last time I'd been anywhere near that building I'd been bleeding and desperate, and the time before that I'd been the reason a room full of evaluators had a story to tell for years, and neither of those was a reputation I wanted following a gift straight to her desk. I stood outside the entrance for longer than I want to admit, running through and immediately discarding one excuse after another, before I finally accepted that the honest version of any of it, a stranger showing up with money he wasn't supposed to have, for a reason he couldn't fully explain to anyone's satisfaction, was never going to land as anything other than suspicious, no matter how carefully I dressed it up first. I couldn't exactly walk into the medical wing and hand a stranger a package. The last time I'd been anywhere near that building I'd been bleeding and desperate, and the time before that I'd been the reason a room full of evaluators had a story to tell for years, and neither of those was a reputation I wanted following a gift straight to her desk. It struck me as a genuinely strange thing to be nervous about, handing someone a gift instead of taking something from them. But nervous was precisely what I was, the whole walk home. I didn't think about it again for a few days, mostly because I had no way to check whether it had even reached her, let alone whether she'd used it. I went back to hauling. I went back to rent math and food math, same as ever, -8 bronze I no longer had to work with. It was Bae who told me, in the offhand way she told me most things, somewhere between handing out card assignments and reading whatever was on that cracked tablet of hers. There's gossip going around the medical wing, she said, not looking up. Some trainee healer had tested up a full rating out of nowhere, funded by an advancement course nobody could explain, and the front desk clerk couldn't even describe the man who'd dropped it off. Bae's own theory, delivered with a short laugh, was a secret admirer with more money than sense. She went straight back to her tablet after that, never noticing I'd gone quiet over a broken gauntlet. Bae didn't know I'd ever met Yuna. I didn't tell her. Wu Yuna's healer rank, trainee to journeyman. I stood in the middle of that debris pile holding a dead gauntlet and felt something that had absolutely nothing to do with the bronze I'd spent to cause it. 35 bronze had gone in, quietly, from a man with no name attached and nothing to gain that anyone could point to. I decided, standing there with 8 lonely bronze left to my name and a debris cart still half full, that I liked that particular math a great deal better than the rent math I'd been doing my entire life. I stood in the middle of that debris pile holding a dead gauntlet and felt something that had absolutely nothing to do with the bronze I'd spent to cause it. A journeyman healer had come out the other end, on record, with her own name on it, a rank she'd earned twice, once by studying for it, and once by nobody ever finding out who'd handed her the chance. I had a strong feeling I was going to be doing a lot more of it, one way or another. The dungeon that changed how I thought about my own entire job was, on paper, nothing special, a mid-tier clearance zone, an A-rank party in and out in under an hour, the kind of assignment that barely registered on the manifest before it landed, unremarkable and unremembered, on my cart list for the day. I almost skipped that whole back corner without a second thought. 6 whole days ago, I definitely would have. I didn't skip it, because 3 weeks of doing this had taught me that the corners nobody bothered walking to were exactly where the good stuff ended up. No hunter trains for the boring part. The room was still a mess from the fight. Scorch marks up one wall and a spray pattern that told me exactly where somebody had missed, a support beam that had come down during the scuffle and never gotten cleared, chamber furniture splintered into pieces too small to identify, dust still hanging thick enough in the air to taste. Usually a room like this meant more cracked helmets and stripped bolts, an hour of bending and bagging for a handful of bronze that barely registered by then. This time it meant a shattered ornamental staff wedged under that collapsed beam, half buried in rubble nobody had bothered clearing to check what was underneath it. Snapped clean in 2 separate pieces, the metal core exposed and dark, gemstones missing from half their settings, the kind of ruin that usually meant somebody had already stripped it for parts before discarding what was left over. Reading wreckage, by now, worked the way other people read prices, at a glance, mostly right, occasionally embarrassingly wrong. I could tell a spent mana core from a live one by the color of the crack running through it, the same unglamorous skill nobody sets out to learn on purpose. This piece read, unmistakably, as a total loss, ceremonial by the engraving still visible on one intact section, old lettering, some noble house's crest worn down past recognizing, worth long gone. I almost left it right there under the beam. A staff this thoroughly wrecked was, statistically, exactly the kind of quiet zero that made up most of an average shift and never earned a second look. I checked it over anyway, crouched in the dust with the beam still overhead, one hand braced flat against a chunk of collapsed masonry, mostly out of that same exact old habit that had gotten my finger bitten clean off 3 whole weeks earlier, minus the part where anything alive was involved this particular time around. Liquidated, shattered ceremonial focus staff to plus 120 bronze. I sat there, still crouched, and stared at that number for considerably longer than the 10 seconds the lantern core had earned back at the clinic. 120 bronze, from a piece of wreckage I'd almost stepped straight over. I checked that panel twice over, the way a person checks a receipt when the total looks wrong, and it held steady both times, same number, cold stone biting into my knees the whole time I stared at it. Level, 4 to 5. Strength, 4 to 5. Vitality, 4 to 5. Perception, 4 to 5. Bronze, 128. I sat down on the rubble pile, catching my breath. This snapped, stripped, discarded staff, sitting in a garbage pile, had just out-earned every evaluator's opinion of me from the day I ruined a national treasure for one insulting coin. A coin I could now name a rank for, since I finally knew what 100 of them added up to. There was nothing left of it to bag. No metal, no gem settings, no engraving, just the panel and the number and empty rubble where a staff had been a moment earlier. Whoever had walked away from this had never thought about what happened to it after. Why would they? I thought about the hazardous waste bin behind the clinic desk, stuffed with things an organization built on rank had stopped seeing as worth anything to anyone. An entire economy of people too successful to notice what they threw away and nobody positioned to pick it back up, except whichever sanitation crew got handed the cleanup shift, cart after cart, room after room, for exactly as long as it took to notice what that actually meant. Nobody else on my crew was doing this. Not one of them stayed late to turn a shield over twice, or had any reason to. The pay didn't change whether you checked twice or once, so checking twice was just a way to work longer for free, if you thought about it the way they clearly did. The reason I did it anyway was the only part of this whole arrangement that actually belonged to me. I didn't have a plan yet. Just 128 bronze, a body that could lift more than it used to, and a room full of things everyone else on payroll had already decided weren't worth a second look. The rest of that room took another hour to clear, longer than it should have. I checked the seams of a chipped shield, the weight of a fire-blackened lantern, the give of a chair leg that turned out to actually just be a chair leg. A cracked shield I'd have carted without a glance a week ago got turned over twice before it went in. A bundle of scorched rope earned real consideration before I confirmed it was, in fact, just rope. The lift ride up was quiet, just me and the cart, and the hum of the mechanism and the cart wheel's one bent caster ticking against the floor plates every few seconds. A dented lockbox with no visible hinge made me stop for a full minute, running a hand along every seam looking for a catch, before I gave up and liquidated it on a guess. Empty inside, worth nothing outside it either. A half-melted signet ring got the same full minute, turned edge to edge under what little light made it back into that corner, before it liquidated for barely enough bronze to notice. Most of what came after stayed exactly what it looked like, correctly identified, this time on purpose. And I spent the whole climb doing the same kind of math a person does after a good week at the tables. Not sure yet whether to trust the number, checking it again anyway. Then I finished clocking out and walked past the same evaluation hall where a dagger had ruined my life 3 weeks earlier, and I understood something on that walk that I hadn't let myself say out loud until right then. Trash wasn't a fixed category. It was just whatever the last person to touch it had stopped caring about. Every ranked hunter in that building was manufacturing my inventory for free, one discarded, half-stripped, not worth carrying object at a time, and not one of them would ever know it. The guild had spent 3 weeks teaching me I was worth nothing. What it had actually handed me, without meaning to, was the only monopoly in the building nobody else was smart enough, or desperate enough, to want. The morning started ordinary enough, a slow clearance zone, mostly dented buckles and split leather straps. The kind of shift where the bronze came in slow and unremarkable a piece at a time. A busted crossbow with a snapped string paid out just enough to notice. Liquidated, cracked hunting crossbow to plus 40 bronze. Bronze, 168. 168. I stared at that number longer than the payout deserved, mostly because it was the first shift where I had enough sitting in one place to actually consider spending some of it on myself instead of on somebody else's healer bill. I found out the system had a shop the same way I found out most things about it, by accident, poking at a menu I'd never bothered opening because I'd never had enough bronze sitting around to make opening it worth the trip. I pulled up my status window during the slow stretch after, thumb dragging across tabs I'd swiped past without reading 100 times before, and found one I'd never once stopped on. Stat allocation. 1 strength point, 40 bronze. 1 vitality point, 40 bronze. 1 perception point, 40 bronze. No catch listed anywhere I could find. No fine print. No cooldown. No warning that a stat bought this way behaved any differently from a stat earned the slow way through 3 weeks of hauling. Just a straight, ugly, honest exchange rate between money and muscle, sitting there the whole time behind a tab I'd never had a reason to open. I scrolled past it twice before I let myself actually consider it. Every real ability this system had handed me came with warning labels I only found by getting hurt first, a goblin's claws through my hand, a finger I still hadn't grown back, and buying a stat outright had no equivalent warning anywhere on the screen. The menu offered nothing except the price and the button, over and over, patient in a way that never once needed to explain itself to anyone. 40 bronze for 1 point of strength was either the best deal in this entire city or a trap dressed up as one, and I had exactly no way to tell which from a menu screen. The only honest test was to spend the money and find out, and I'd spent 3 weeks learning that honest tests cost more than they advertised. Strength, 5 to 6. Bronze, 128. 40 spent, 128 remaining in the total, and one new number sitting on my status window that hadn't been there an hour ago. Nothing exploded. No panel of warnings, no second cost hidden behind the first. Just a single point added to a number I'd watched climb naturally, one grinding week at a time, now moving because I'd told it to instead of because I'd earned it the slow way. It was, uncomfortably, a second layer of cheating stacked on the first one, a strange thing to feel guilty about from a system that had already given me an ability nobody else on the planet had. I didn't buy more. 40 bronze a point added up fast against a total that had taken 3 weeks and 1 shattered staff to build, and I still didn't fully trust the exchange rate wasn't hiding something I hadn't found yet. 1 point was a test. I wanted to see what 1 point actually bought before I committed a real chunk of my savings to finding out the hard way, a caution I'd skipped entirely, oddly, the day I handed 35 bronze to a healer I'd met exactly once. That course had cost more than this stat point would, and I'd handed it over without a second's hesitation. No test purchase, no scrolling back and forth first. Spending on Yuna had never once registered as a risk worth weighing. Spending on myself, apparently, still did. I found out at the start of my next shift, hauling a standard sanitation bin, the same model I'd wrestled with clumsily for 3 weeks, reinforced steel, wheels on one end, a lid that needed 2 hands and a shoulder to seat properly once it was full. I grabbed the handle the same way I always did, without thinking about it, muscle memory doing the work my brain hadn't caught up to yet. The bin came off the ground like it weighed nothing. Not lighter. Nothing. My arm kept moving at the speed it always moved at, and the bin followed it at a speed built for something with a fraction of its actual mass, and the 2 speeds met in the worst possible way, straight into the loading rail bolted to the cart behind me. Reinforced steel crumpled to scrap in 1 point of impact. The lid popped its hinges and clattered somewhere I didn't see it land. Half a shift's worth of debris scattered across the floor in a spray wide enough that 3 separate people down the corridor turned to look before the noise had even finished echoing. I stood there holding a bent handle attached to nothing, more strength in one arm than I'd had any real practice using, and understood exactly what 40 bronze had actually bought me, not a small edge. A completely different set of physics I hadn't calibrated for yet, applied to a job built entirely around fine motor control and careful handling, at the exact moment I least expected to need to recalibrate. 3 weeks of hauling had trained my body to expect a certain amount of resistance from a full bin, and my arm had spent 3 weeks learning exactly how much force to put behind a lift to clear the ground without overshooting. That calibration was gone, replaced overnight by a number on a menu, and nobody had warned me the 2 didn't update on the same schedule. A stat bot outright, it turned out, moved the number instantly. It did not move the muscle memory that had been built around the old one. Bay's voice carried the length of the corridor before she did. "What did you just do to that?" she demanded, staring at guild property that had, for seconds earlier, been a functioning bin. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have required explaining a menu I wasn't supposed to have access to, in front of an audience that had definitely noticed a sanitation worker crumple reinforced steel with one hand. So I told her I dropped it. Technically true, and covering approximately none of what had actually happened. She wasn't buying it. She crouched to pick up a piece of the folded rail, turning it over slowly, clearly hoping a second look would show her something other than what the first one had, and told me flatly that reinforced steel didn't dent. She'd watched a hunter throw a goblin corpse into one of these and seen it bounce off. I repeated myself anyway, because I didn't have anything better, and repeating a bad answer somehow felt less obviously bad than inventing a new one on the spot. She didn't call me a liar out loud. She didn't need to. The look she gave the bent handle, then my hand, then me, did that work for her. Around us the corridor had gone quieter than it should have. 2 other sanitation workers slowing their carts to watch without pretending not to. And somewhere further off I heard someone repeating what had happened to someone who'd missed it, the story already changing shape on its second telling. Bay straightened up, dropped the piece of rail back onto the pile with a clang that felt louder than it needed to be, and didn't move to leave. She told me to fill out the incident form, then come find her after my shift so we could talk about this properly, the phrase landing with a weight that told me she didn't use it lightly. She held my eyes one more second before she turned and walked off toward the next corridor, leaving me standing over a bent handle and a bill I couldn't produce a receipt for, next to someone who was clearly already doing the math herself. The assignment sheet called it a B-rank clearance, a den some kind of pack of shadow wolves had holed up in before a hunter party burned through them in an afternoon. Nothing about the paperwork said anything about the smell a low, sour rot that hit somewhere between the 3rd and 4th sublevel, thick enough that I stopped in the stairwell and actually considered turning around before my shift technically started. The stairwell itself had gone dark past the 2nd landing. The overhead strips either burned out or never wired this deep in the first place, and I'd made the trip down 4 flights with nothing but the cart's single-mounted lantern throwing a narrow cone of light against walls still scored with claw marks from whatever fight had happened here. The 2 workers assigned ahead of me had apparently made the opposite call 3 separate times that week, signed off on a partial clearance each time, and left the deep end of the den for whoever drew the short straw next. That turned out to be me. I didn't turn around. 3 weeks of this job had taught me that a smell like that usually meant something worth checking, not something worth avoiding. The den itself was a wreck even by packed den standards. Bones, fur, splintered furniture from whatever this space had been before the wolves moved in, claw marks scored deep into what was left of the walls. The whole chamber sunk into a permanent gray half-light from a ceiling vent choked with debris. I worked the room the way I worked every room by then, methodically, corner to corner, checking under the collapsed furniture, and behind the bone piles the earlier sweeps had clearly stepped straight past on their way to an easier exit. The den itself was a wreck even by packed den standards. Bones, fur, splintered furniture from whatever this space had been before the wolves moved in, claw marks scored deep into what was left of the walls. The whole chamber sunk into a permanent gray half-light from a ceiling vent choked with debris. Somebody had stashed this here long before the pack ever claimed the room, and forgotten it, or died somewhere the guild's records never bothered to follow up on. I dug it free by hand, one knee planted in bedding I tried hard not to think too closely about, and turned it over in the weak light looking for a maker's mark or a nameplate stamped somewhere into the metal. Nothing, just old iron, and a lock plate rusted solid around a keyhole nobody was ever coming back to use. The metal was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature, the particular dead cold of something that had sat untouched long enough to stop remembering it had ever been handled, rust flaking off under my thumb in a fine orange dust that stuck to the sweat on my hands. I gave the lid one honest shove, more out of habit than hope, and felt exactly the amount of give a 50-year-old rusted hinge gives up on the first try, which is to say none at all. There was a version of this exact moment where I forced the hinge open by hand instead and actually looked inside first. Old coin, a keepsake, somebody's name I could maybe return to a family that had spent years wondering. I dug it free by hand, one knee planted in bedding I tried hard not to think too closely about, and turned it over in the weak light looking for a maker's mark or a nameplate stamped somewhere into the metal. Nothing, just old iron, and a lock plate rusted solid around a keyhole nobody was ever coming back to use. The lock didn't budge for anything short of honest force, and honest force wasn't something I had much use asking permission for anymore. Liquidated, sealed iron strongbox. Contents unknown. A plus 55 bronze. Bronze, 183. 183. I sat back on my heels in the rotted bedding and stared at that number the way I'd stared at the staff 2 weeks earlier. A single unremarkable box, dragged out of a den nobody had thought to search past the obvious kill count, worth more than most of a week's ordinary hauling. My strength climbed with it. Same as always. One more grinding proof that this job kept paying in more than one currency at once. Level 6A6. Level held steady this time, €1. The stat point I'd bought off the menu the week before had apparently borrowed against a curve that hadn't finished catching up yet, which was its own strange kind of relief. At least the system's accounting made some kind of internal sense, even when I didn't fully understand the mechanism behind it. I sat back on my heels in the rotted bedding and stared at that number the way I'd stared at the staff 2 weeks earlier. A single unremarkable box, dragged out of a den nobody had thought to search past the obvious kill count, worth more than most of a week's ordinary hauling. 3 separate sweeps had signed off on this den as cleared, initials logged and everything, and not one of them had bothered dragging a rusted box out of a nest they'd clearly seen sitting right there. Level held steady this time, €1. The stat point I'd bought off the menu the week before had apparently borrowed against a curve that hadn't finished catching up yet, which was its own strange kind of relief. I filed that under the same growing list everything else this job kept teaching me, and was still turning it over, €1, wondering how many more rooms like this one were sitting untouched under a kill count somebody had rubber stamped and moved past, €1, when the wall behind me exhaled. Not collapsed. Exhaled, the way a person does right before they move. A held breath let go a half second before the body follows it. I still hadn't bought another point since. The memory of a bent bin handle and Bay's face still fresh enough to keep my thumb well clear of that particular tap. The dust on the ceiling vent above me had stopped drifting the way dust drifts when nothing's disturbing it. I'd walked past both details without registering either one, the way I'd walked past 100 rooms before this one, assuming stillness meant empty. I never got the chance to turn around and check. Every survival instinct 3 hard weeks on this job had beaten into me went off at once, cold and immediate, an entire beat before my conscious mind caught up to why. Something dropped out of the ceiling rafters onto my back before the thought finished forming. A controlled, deliberate weight instead of a wild lunge, both knees driving into my shoulder blades, and a forearm locking hard across my throat before I'd even finished falling forward into the rubble. A shadow along the top of the far wall sat a fraction too dense, too still, for a room lit only by whatever daylight fought its way down 4 sublevels of collapsed stairwell. A voice at my ear, low and furious, close enough that I felt more than heard it, told me to tell whoever had sent me that the box was already empty. The arm across my throat tightened, not testing anymore, committed, and I felt something else shift against my spine in the same motion, €1 long, warm, unmistakably not a limb, coiling once and going still like it was bracing for the same fight the rest of her already was. Nobody washed a sealed box for 2 straight days, she said, and just happened to wander in and clear it in under a minute. I know exactly what you are. You don't. I managed, ere more than words, the arm across my throat leaving very little room for either syllable. It wasn't much of an argument, and I didn't get the chance to make a better one. It took about a minute of me lying face down in wolf bedding, insisting I wasn't whatever she thought I was, before she finally let me up, reluctantly, one hand still close enough to grab me again, ears and tail and amber eyes all still fixed on me, still working through whatever problem I apparently still hadn't finished being to her. She'd been solo 3 weeks. Ever since a party she used to run with left her behind mid-dungeon rather than spend the 40 seconds it would have cost to dig her out. Guild parties hire freelance specialists by the job, not the contract. No paperwork required to just not come back for one, No consequence attached either. No record anywhere that would ever flag it as anything but a routine roster change. She'd been scavenging alone since, tracking half-buried value by scent and instinct through debris nobody sane would call passable, sleeping in whatever corner of whatever sublevel felt defensible that particular night, watching that strongbox for 2 straight days because something about its stillness had told her it mattered. She asked how I'd known it was worth breaking into at all, when 3 separate sanitation sweeps had already walked past it without a second glance. She'd been scavenging alone since, tracking half-buried value by scent and instinct through debris nobody sane would call passable, sleeping in whatever corner of whatever sublevel felt defensible that particular night, watching that strongbox for 2 straight days because something about its stillness had told her it mattered. What she couldn't do, she admitted, flatly, without any of the pride I might have expected from someone this good at her actual job, was turn anything she found into money without a guild evaluator taking a cut and asking questions neither of us wanted answered. What I could do, apparently, solved that problem entirely. Neither of us said the word partnership out loud. Not once, the whole conversation. We didn't need to. She proposed exactly one test, one site, and if it worked, we'd talk properly about what came next. The test site turned out to be smaller than I expected. A collapsed storage alcove 2 corridors over that she'd found weeks earlier and never been able to touch. A cracked mana battery wedged behind rubble no evaluator would ever sign off on recovering. She'd known exactly where it was the whole time. Knowing hadn't done her any good without someone able to actually turn it into something spendable. I put my hand on it. The panel came up clean. Liquidated. Cracked mana battery to plus 90 bronze. Bronze, 273. Level, 6 to 7. Strength, 6 to 7. Vitality, 6 to 7. Perception, 6 to 7. 90 bronze. Out of a battery she'd walked past a dozen times without a way to collect on it. My grip strengthened right along with it. One more grinding proof of the same pattern, but this time I watched her watch the number appear instead of watching it myself. And something in her whole posture changed once it held steady. Not relief exactly, something closer to a bet she hadn't fully expected to pay off actually paying off. She didn't say anything. She just turned and started walking, which I was already learning was her version of a verdict. I tried to keep pace and immediately regretted it. 3 sublevels of debris navigated at a stealth specialist's idea of a casual walk turned out to be a full-effort scramble for someone who still hauled a cart for a living. Cartwheels catching on every loose stone she stepped clean over without breaking stride, and I went down hard over a support beam I never saw in the dark, cart and all, in a crash loud enough to echo. Sanitation, she said, not unkindly. Might want to invest in a light source. I didn't have a comeback for that one. I picked the cart back up and kept following, ears burning in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion. She moved with the total confidence of someone who owned the room, silent in a way that made my own footsteps sound embarrassing by comparison, weight shifting to the balls of her feet over every uncertain patch of rubble a full step before I'd have even noticed it was uncertain. Twice more she stopped dead, head tilted, reading something in the air I had no way to perceive, before waving me forward again, and once she reached back without looking and steered my cart 2 full feet left around a patch of floor that, to my eyes, was completely indistinguishable from every other patch of floor around it. I asked what had been wrong with that particular stretch of floor. She said she didn't know yet, and that not knowing yet was exactly why we were walking around it instead of straight through it. The corridor finally opened into a chamber that hadn't been on any clearance record I'd ever handled. No manifest number stenciled on the entry, no kill count tally, no sign any sanctioned party had ever set foot inside it. The air itself felt different the moment we crossed the threshold, stiller, older, the particular dead quiet of a room that had gone this long, without a single person breathing inside it. The gray half-light showed a floor buried under more broken gear than I'd seen in any single room since I'd started this job. Cracked weapon housings stacked 3 deep in places, shattered focus cores scattered loose across every surface, armor plating stripped and discarded in piles nobody had ever bothered to log, let alone clear. A support column near the back had partially collapsed at some point, burying an entire second layer of debris under the first that I couldn't even begin to guess at from the doorway. A dead zone, invisible to the guild's own records, sitting untouched at the exact bottom of every sweep report that had ever passed through this sector. If a single cracked mana battery in a forgotten alcove had paid 90 bronze, a room this size, buried this deep, ignored this thoroughly, wasn't going to pay in tens or even hundreds. It was going to take more than one shift, more than one cart, more than the 2 of us working alone to even inventory properly, let alone clear. I counted at least 6 weapon housings just from the doorway, each one worth more intact than any of the debris I usually hauled, and that was before accounting for whatever the collapsed column in the back was still hiding under it. Sasha crouched near the entrance, one hand flat against the floor, reading the room the way she'd read every room since we'd started walking. Nothing living, she said eventually, not for a long time. Whatever had happened here, a fight nobody survived to report, a collapse nobody dug back out from. It had happened well before either of us had ever set foot in this sector, and it had stayed exactly this untouched every single day since. Sasha stopped at the threshold, ears flat, and looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her yet. Not suspicion this time, something closer to disbelief at her own luck. "Tell me you can liquidate all of this," she said. "Tell me you can liquidate all of this," she said. 3 days into the dead zone, and Sasha and I had barely made a dent in it. We'd worked out a rhythm without ever discussing one. She cleared a path and flagged anything her instincts snagged on. I put a hand on whatever she pointed at and turned it into a number neither of us had to explain to anyone. She'd stopped bracing every single time I reached out to touch something. I noticed, somewhere around the start of the second day. Small thing, and neither of us mentioned it. 4 separate cartloads so far, hauled up through the same forgotten service corridor a few pieces at a time, spaced out over several shifts so no single day's total looked unusual against my normal numbers, logged on my sheet as ordinary debris from an ordinary clearance zone 2 floors above where the actual room sat. Sasha never touched a cart herself. She couldn't, not without a guild badge to explain why a freelance tracker was hauling sanitation debris through corridors she had no official reason to be in. So the actual laundering of the numbers fell entirely to me, one modest, unremarkable entry at a time, exactly the kind of paperwork nobody had ever once questioned in 3 weeks of this job. She'd meet me at the top of the service stairwell each evening instead, out of sight of the cart return desk, and split whatever the day's haul had come to on the spot, in cash, before either of us went back to pretending we hadn't spent the day together. That particular morning's haul was a cracked Siege-class ballista bolt, snapped clean through the shaft, the fletching scorched down to bare metal and still faintly warm from whatever had broken it in the first place. Monster husks paid better than gear, usually. This paid better than either. Liquidated, fractured Siege ballista bolt to plus 130 bronze. Bronze, 403. 403. My strength kept climbing right along with it, same as every single time, a pattern reliable enough by now that I'd stopped being surprised by it weeks ago. Level, 7 to 8. Strength, 7 to 8. Vitality, 7 to 8. Perception, 7 to 8. Sasha whistled low at the panel over my shoulder, ears twitching once, the closest thing to open approval I'd gotten out of her in 3 full days of working together. Neither of us said the actual number out loud where anyone in the stairwell might have heard it. I clocked out that evening the same way I clocked out every single evening, cart parked, sheet filed, Nothing on paper that would have told anyone I'd made more in one single morning than most of the crew made in a full month. Nobody had ever built a reason to look closely at a sanitation worker's numbers, because a sanitation worker's numbers had never once in the guild's history been worth looking at. That was still true when I walked into the break room the next morning. Chipped laminate tables, a coffee machine that had stopped working properly sometime in the last decade, the low murmur of a crew comparing sore backs before the shift bell rang. It stopped being true about 4 minutes later. The man standing at the front of the room didn't belong there, not in the way anyone belonged in a break room built for people who spent their days bagging carcasses. Pressed navy pinstripe, gold-rimmed glasses, hair combed back with a precision that read less as grooming and more as a personal filing system extended to his own scalp. He had the kind of stillness that made every ordinary worker in that entire room instinctively lower their voice, without anyone actually telling them to. Bae introduced him without much warmth at all in her voice, standing a full half-step further from him than she stood from anyone else in that entire room, which told me more about him than the actual introduction did. Director Park Sang-hoon, Internal Guild Auditor, Market Enforcement Division. He didn't offer a handshake or a smile to go with the name, just a slow, deliberate scan of the room, not a greeting, an inventory count, each of U.S. registered and filed before he'd said a single further word. He'd come down personally, he told us, because his division had flagged an irregularity worth investigating in person rather than delegating, an unexplained pattern of value discrepancies across several recent clearance logs, numbers that didn't reconcile the way they should have across multiple independent sweeps. He read out 2 figures from a slim black tablet he never once lowered enough for anyone in the room to actually see. Expected recovery values measured against a formula his division had spent years calibrating across thousands of comparable clearances citywide, and the gap between the two, he said, wasn't statistical noise. It was a pattern, nothing conclusive yet. Nothing he was prepared to name specifically, not this morning, not in a room full of people any one of whom might be the actual source of it. What he was prepared to announce was a full audit. Every sanitation account, every liquidation log, every individual worker's recorded totals going back 3 months, cross-referenced against manifest records and cleared against guild-registered evaluator receipts for anything that didn't match cleanly. Full transparency, he called it, in a voice that carried no policy in it at all, only a verdict already rendered and waiting on the paperwork to catch up. Anyone with nothing to hide, he added, glancing once around the room in a way that felt, for one very specific second, like it landed directly on me, had nothing whatsoever to worry about. I kept my face perfectly still. The same disciplined 3 weeks of destroying evidence for a living had apparently trained into me without my ever noticing it happen. Every liquidation I'd ever run had left exactly 0 paper trail by design. No evaluator, no receipt, no manifest line matching a number to an object, nothing an audit could cross-reference against anything at all. That should have made me safe. It made me the single largest unexplained variance the audit was ever going to find. A missing paper trail wasn't invisible to a man whose entire job was reconciling paper trails against reality. It was the loudest kind of gap there was, a hole in the numbers with an exact outline matching whatever had been quietly removed from them. Standing in that break room, watching Director Park read out a mismatch he couldn't yet name, I understood for the first time that my own invisibility had only ever worked against people who weren't specifically trained to notice exactly that shape of absence. Sasha wasn't anywhere in that room. Freelance trackers didn't get pulled into sanitation briefings, whatever their actual reasons for being anywhere near this particular crew, but I found myself running her half of this exact math anyway, the way I'd apparently gotten used to doing over 3 days of working alongside her. 4 cartloads. A dead zone with no manifest number. A partnership neither of us had ever put a name to, built entirely on the assumption that nobody with the authority or the motive to look this closely was ever going to bother. I'd have to find her before the end of the day, before word of an audit reached her through whoever in this building she still talked to, and tell her in person rather than let her hear it secondhand and draw her own conclusions about what it meant for either of us. Director Park folded his hands behind his back, surveyed the room one final, unhurried time with the flat certainty of someone confirming an argument he already considered fully won. The audit begins within the week, he said. Every account. No exceptions. The audit begins within the week, he said. Every account. No exceptions. For more days, clearing the same dead zone with Sasha turned the number into something I genuinely stopped being able to picture in my head. We found what had caused the collapse eventually. The crushed remains of an A-rank hunter, off any manifest, killed by whatever had gone through this sector weeks before either of us ever found it. A name on a shattered breastplate that Sasha recognized without saying a word about how. She stood over it a long moment, silent, mouthing the name once to herself without any sound behind it, before finally telling me to go ahead. I didn't ask what she'd known him as, or how. She didn't offer, and it wasn't the kind of question I had any right pushing on. Full combat gear, built for a fight nobody survives without it, went into the cart the same as everything else out of that room had. Liquidated. A-rank hunter's full combat kit, unclaimed, to plus 999,999,597 bronze. Level, 8 to 9. Strength, 8 to 9. Vitality, 8 to 9. Perception, 8 to 9. Gold, 100,000 hidden. 100,000 gold. 403 bronze, 3 weeks ago, had genuinely registered as the biggest number of my entire life. This new one made that old number small enough to not even bother subtracting from the total. Sasha said it back to herself twice before either of us moved. The same disbelieving cadence a person uses on a price tag they assume is a printing error. Then she said the part that actually mattered more than the number itself. 3 full days from now, Director Park's audit was going to start crawling through every single account in the entire building, and absolutely nothing about a sanitation worker's ordinary paperwork could survive 100,000 gold suddenly appearing anywhere near it. We spent that whole walk back arguing about what to actually do with it. My first instinct was to find somewhere fully legitimate to put it, a proper guild-adjacent lender, something with a license and a door and the general shape of a real solution to a problem this size. Sasha shot that idea down before I finished suggesting it. Anywhere licensed reported to the guild eventually, one way or another, and reporting was exactly what Park's entire audit had been built to go looking for. The actual answer, once we landed on it, was cruder than I expected and considerably simpler for it. 2 districts over, past the same off-registry currency exchange Sasha had used for years unloading unlicensed scavenger finds, sat a private vault built into the back of a pawn shop that never seemed to have a single customer in its front room, run by a proprietor who never once asked why a sanitation worker was carrying more raw currency than she'd probably seen cross her counter all year. It kept no names at all, deposits logged against a number instead of a person, nothing tying the account to me beyond a small brass token I'd carry in my own pocket. It never became a transaction Park's audit could reach, because it never became a transaction at all, just currency, handed over in person, weighed, sealed, and filed under a number that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already hold the matching token. I understood, standing in that back room watching the pawnshop owner seal the deposit box and stamp it with a number instead of a name, that this wasn't a real solution so much as a crude one. A trick that worked exactly because nobody wearing a guild badge had any reason yet to look past a sanitation worker's ordinary paycheck, and a trick I already understood, even then, wouldn't scale forever. I spent the 2 days before the audit doing my level best to look completely unremarkable, which meant hauling exactly the same carts, taking exactly the same lunch break, laughing at exactly the same joke someone on the crew told twice that week, all while the vault's account number ran through my head on a loop, over and over, until it stopped registering as a number at all and started registering as a heartbeat. They noticed I'd gone quieter than usual and asked, once, whether I was worried about the audit. I told her everyone was worried about the audit. That much, at least, was completely true. Director Park conducted the review himself, tablet in hand, going through my official guild account in a small side office that smelled faintly of the same antiseptic as the medical wing, one hunter or worker at a time. The door closed each time between names. My turn came near the very end of the second full day, later than I would have liked given how many hours I'd already spent sitting with it. He didn't offer a greeting, just gestured at the single chair across from his desk and started reading, in that same flat, unhurried voice he'd used announcing the audit in the first place, comparing my recorded totals against 3 full months of clearance logs that should have lined up, cleanly, with exactly what a sanitation worker's ordinary wages looked like. He scrolled slower than I would have liked, twice going all the way back to recheck a single number against something on his own tablet I couldn't quite see the angle of from where I sat. I kept both hands still and my breathing level the entire time, the same discipline I'd apparently been quietly building for 3 solid weeks without ever once calling it that out loud. He asked one question, about a slightly larger than usual entry from a big reward clearance week back, and I gave him the honest answer. A lucky haul, logged properly through the ordinary channel, nothing hidden about it, because that particular entry genuinely wasn't hiding anything. He made a small mark on the tablet, said nothing further about it, and moved on without finding another single thing in the entire 3 months worth stopping for a second time. Clear, he said, not looking up from the tablet, already moving to the next name on his list. Then he did look up, just for a second, taking in the same unremarkable sanitation worker he'd scanned once in a break room days earlier, and something in his expression settled into a kind of dismissal I recognized instantly, because I'd built a career out of being underestimated by exactly that expression. Whatever suspicion had brought him down here personally clearly hadn't survived contact with my actual paperwork. Frankly, he added, already walking away, you're too pathetic to have pulled off anything worth calling theft. I said nothing at all, just nodded once and let him walk away thinking he'd finished with me for good. Sasha caught up with me outside, once the hallway had emptied out, and asked, quietly, how long a numbered token and an unlicensed vault were actually going to hold against an organization that ran audits like this one for a living. She just fell into step right beside me, quiet for the entire rest of the walk, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty so much as busy. Already running the next problem, I didn't have a real answer for her. 100,000 gold fit inside one small vault's backroom today. Whatever came after this, and both of us understood, standing there, that something was always going to come after this, wasn't going to fit inside a brass token forever. She didn't push me for anything more of an answer than that. The same careful way she'd run this one, a step or two ahead of me, same as always, waiting on me to catch up to whatever conclusion she'd already reached on her own. Word travels fast in a building absolutely full of people with nothing better to do than gossip, and by the second week after the audit, too pathetic to steal, had made its way from Director Park's own mouth to every single corner of the sanitation wing, usually delivered with a laugh at my direct expense. I heard it 3 completely separate times before lunch on the very day it started spreading, from 3 different people who'd clearly never once spoken to each other about it at all. They relayed it to me herself, not unkindly, more the way you'd repeat a joke you assumed I'd already heard. I let her think I found it funny too. What I actually found, once I let myself sit with it a full day, was that the whole thing was useful. I'd already worked out, weeks back, that nobody in that building looked closely at what I actually did all day. This was the first time I tried using that on purpose instead of just benefiting from it by accident. actively performing the joke instead of just letting it sit there unchallenged. I started using it on purpose. I asked for the worst assignments now, not despite the reputation, but because of it. The deep, forgotten, over-cleared rooms nobody else wanted, the exact kind of dead zone I'd already learned paid best. I volunteered for the ones with a bad smell attached, the ones with 3-week backlogs nobody had the stomach to touch, the ones the assignment board listed twice because the first crew that took it quietly gave it back unfinished. Nobody questioned any of it. Why would the human garbage disposal want anything else? I let my cart squeak the same way it always squeaked, same slouch, same slow pace. I even let myself flinch a little louder than necessary whenever a heavier crate landed on the cart, the same small performance of ordinary weakness I'd apparently been giving away for free since the day this whole thing started, except now I finally understood it was worth something, and I started giving it deliberately instead of by accident. I made a point of complaining about my back once a week too, always to the same 2 people, always in the exact same bored, tired tone, mostly because it was easy and nobody had ever once thought to question it. Underneath all of it, I was clearing rooms faster than any sanitation worker in that guild's entire history, and not one supervisor besides Bay had any framework for noticing, because none of them had ever once looked closely enough to build one. That week's assignment was a hoarder's den 3 floors down, a defeated hunter party's abandoned staging room, condemned after a partial collapse, marked for eventual demolition and left to sit exactly where the collapse had left it. Gear stacked floor to ceiling in a way that made the room look smaller than it actually was. Broken weapon racks, 3 deep in places, their contents spilled across the floor in drifts nobody had ever bothered sorting. Crates of ration tins gone black with age, the printed labels long since rotted well past any actual reading. A rack of practice dummies still wearing the dents of whatever training regimen this party had run before it stopped existing, straw stuffing spilling out of 3 separate gashes nobody had ever bothered mending. A single boot, no partner anywhere in the room, standing upright in the middle of the floor, set down mid-step by someone who had simply never once come back for it. A whole generation's worth of equipment some dead or scattered party had simply never come back to claim. Chest plates dented well past any armorer's actual interest, a dozen shields with the exact same crack running through each one, whatever a full clearing crew had decided, years and years ago now, simply wasn't worth the trip back down for. All of it filed under the single flattest word the guild's own manifest system had for anything it didn't want to think about. Trash. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, doing the math the way I now did it automatically, room volume against average payout against the sheer, stupid scale of a guild-wide habit of throwing away anything that stopped being convenient the moment its original owners stopped needing it. A room this size, this thoroughly ignored, had never once turned out to be a small number in 3 full weeks of learning to read exactly this particular kind of silence. Walls first, where the bulk always sat. Center last, where the smaller, easier stuff always ended up kicked. Corners checked once, quickly, out of the same habit that had cost me a finger and had never once let me skip a corner since. Handout, touching everything that qualified. Liquidated, abandoned staging cash, bulk, to plus 1,500,000,000 bronze. The panel came up almost before I'd finished walking past the last shelf, one continuous sweep instead of 100 separate decisions. 3 full weeks of learning exactly what broken enough actually meant compressed down into a single motion through a room nobody official had bothered walking through in months. I hadn't stopped moving once. No pause to check a lock plate, no second look at a shield to decide whether it counted, none of the hesitation that had slowed me down back when every single judgment call still carried the risk of being the wrong one. Level, 9 to 10. Strength, 9 to 10. Vitality, 9 to 10. Perception, 9 to 10. Gold, 250,000. That single room alone had added more to the vault than everything I'd liquidated across the 3 full weeks before it combined, and it pushed the running total sitting in that numbered box 2 districts over past 250,000 gold for the very first time, out of a room the guild's own paperwork had already decided was worthless twice over, once when the party abandoned it, and again when a clerk stamped the word trash on the manifest and moved on with his day, never once wondering what that single stamp had actually thrown away. My whole body climbed a full level in the same stroke, the same pattern holding steady no matter how large the number attached to it got, and I no longer felt the small jolt of disbelief that used to come with it. I was still standing in the doorway, cart barely a third full because there was nothing left in that room with any real mass to it anymore, catching my breath in the sudden quiet a fully emptied room always left behind, when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick ones, unscheduled, the particular rhythm of someone who'd come to check on a job rather than assign one. Bae, clipboard against her hip, genuinely out of breath in a way that strongly suggested she'd taken the stairs the whole way down rather than wait around on the lift. Her mouth opened. "That whole room," she started, and stopped there, still looking past me at the bare walls, eyes doing a slow second sweep across shelving that hadn't changed a single inch since her first one. She stopped mid-stride at the sight of a floor-to-ceiling hoarder's den already stripped down to bare shelving and swept concrete. 3 previous crews' worth of half-finished write-ups sitting somewhere in a file for a job that had apparently just taken one man alone a matter of seconds to actually finish. The rival supervisor's name was Choi, and he ran the third-floor crew the exact way you'd expect from a man who thought a clipboard was a personality. Pressed uniform, exactly on time to every shift change, a laminated productivity chart he carried everywhere like it might get stolen. He'd been sniffing around my assignment sheet for a full 2 weeks straight, ever since word first got around that Bae's crew was somehow clearing more square footage per shift than crews carrying twice the head count. He never once asked how. He just started building a file. I found out about the file the exact way I found out about most things that mattered, from Sasha, who'd overheard it secondhand from someone who owed her a favor and had no idea why. She'd found me in the usual back stairwell spot where we split the day's take, and led with it before I'd even set the cart down. Someone was building a case against me. She didn't know who yet, only that it was serious enough that whoever told her had lowered their voice doing it. Choi's theory, delivered to 3 separate people in the break room over the course of 1 week, was that I was skimming. Not liquidating trash for the guild's benefit, pocketing gear that should have gone through proper channels, and reselling it off the books somewhere nobody official would ever check. He had 0 actual evidence, not 1 receipt or witness, because the actual truth was so much stranger than the crime he'd invented that nobody sane would have guessed it in 100 tries. But he didn't need evidence to file a request. He needed a headcount reduction to hit his own quarterly numbers, and a sanitation worker nobody official had ever looked twice at made an easy, quiet line item to cut before anyone upstairs asked too many questions about it. I liquidated an entire abandoned munitions depot that week without once thinking about Choi, because I genuinely hadn't clocked him as a real threat of any kind yet, let alone one worth losing sleep over. Liquidated, abandoned munitions depot, bulk, to plus 2,500,000,000 bronze. Level, 10 to 11. Strength, 10 to 11. Vitality, 10 to 11. Perception, 10 to 11. Gold, 500,000. 500,000 gold. The Vault 2 districts over had stopped registering as a real place I visited and started registering as a number I checked, and my whole body strengthened right on schedule. Same pattern, same proof this job paid in more than 1 coin whether I was paying attention or not. I was still thinking about depot layouts and cart routes when Bae found me at the end of shift, jaw set in a way I'd never once seen on her. Choi had filed a formal termination request that morning, she told me, citing a pattern of unverifiable output inconsistent with standard crew productivity, a phrase a whole committee had apparently spent an entire afternoon crafting specifically to mean nothing at all. What it actually meant, once Bae translated it out of the jargon, was that Choi had decided the easiest fix for numbers he didn't understand was making the numbers source disappear instead of asking a single honest question about them. She was already walking toward the supervisor offices before she'd finished explaining it, and I had to jog 2 steps to catch up. I told her she didn't have to fight this on my account. I could find other work, and I had roughly 500,000 reasons not to panic about losing a sanitation job specifically. She stopped walking just long enough to give me a look that made it clear exactly how stupid that had sounded. I wasn't other people's problem to solve, she said. You're my crew. That was the whole argument, apparently, and she didn't wait for me to make a counter one. She just kept walking, and I understood, somewhere in the 3 weeks since a peeled pear and a goblin bite, that this had stopped being a supervisor doing her paperwork a long time ago, without either of us ever once saying so out loud. The meeting happened in a glass-walled office, blinds cracked just enough that the entire third-floor break room got a free show through them, plenty of witnesses pretending not to watch on their way past. He'd even color-coded it, 3 different highlighter shades for whatever system he'd invented to make an unfounded accusation look like actual data. Explain the numbers, Choi said, sliding the chart across without once looking at me directly. They got the question, apparently, since I hadn't earned a direct one of my own. Bae's answer was short. I was efficient. That was the whole explanation, and efficiency wasn't a punishable offense just because it made his own crew's numbers look bad by comparison. Choi didn't accept that. Efficiency didn't triple output without a mechanism behind it, he said, and an unexplained mechanism was precisely what guild policy required investigating before it got worse. What he wanted was a real audit, not Director Park's paperwork review, but a physical shadow shift, someone watching my every move for a full week to document exactly how a sanitation worker was outperforming veteran crews by this margin. I kept my face still and did the math on what a full week of direct observation would actually reveal about a man who could erase entire rooms with a touch. The number was not good. A week of someone watching every liquidation, every panel, every number that made no sense against any manifest, and there wasn't a version of that week that ended with me still employed, let alone free. They didn't blink. I don't think she fully understood what a shadow shift would actually uncover, but she understood exactly what it would do to me regardless. A full week of a stranger standing over my shoulder, documenting a job I'd spent 3 weeks quietly building into something else entirely. That alone was apparently reason enough. Clear it with Director Park directly, she told him. In writing, with a stated cause that wasn't just, this worker makes me personally uncomfortable. Until then, the request was denied. The file went nowhere. And he could explain to Park himself exactly why he'd tried firing a documented top performer over a hunch he'd never once bothered verifying. Choi opened his mouth to argue. Nothing useful came out of it before Bae was already up out of her chair and moving toward the door. We're done here, she said, and didn't wait to see if he agreed. I caught up with her out in the corridor, still running the numbers on how close a shadow shift had just come to actually happening. 1 week, maybe 2, from an ending I genuinely didn't want to picture in any detail, and told her, honestly, that I owed her one I wasn't at all sure I could ever fully pay back. She didn't look at me, and she didn't slow down either. She just pulled a pear out of her bag, split it clean with her thumbs the way she always did, and held half of it out toward me without breaking stride once. I didn't know her anything at all, she said. Just keep being good at the job, same as always. Choi wasn't going to let this go quietly, and neither, she added, were the 3 other people he'd already talked into agreeing with him behind closed doors. Bae's warning about Choi's file sat with me for exactly 1 day before I decided the smartest thing I could do about it was nothing at all, at least for now. Choi wanted a shadow shift he wasn't going to get. Park hadn't asked for one either. And every hour I spent worrying about a paper trail I couldn't actually control was an hour I wasn't spending on the one thing I could. So the next morning I did what I always did. I showed up early, took the worst assignment on the board, and let the whole building keep believing whatever it wanted to believe about me. Whatever Choi thought he had, he didn't have it yet, and a man who color-coded his own accusations wasn't going to move fast on anything. Sasha found me before I'd even reached the lift. She had a knack for turning up right when I stopped moving, footsteps already matched to mine before I'd even noticed her behind me. 2 levels below the sanitation wing's official boundary, she told me, past a stretch of corridor the guild's own maps listed as structurally condemned and therefore not worth patrolling by anyone with a badge. You're going to want to see this one yourself, she said, already moving before I'd finished setting my cart down. A cull site. Not scrap, not abandoned gear. An actual monster cull, the kind the guild ran on a fixed schedule nobody below C rank ever got told about, clearing a breeding nest before it grew past the point of easy containment. The bodies got hauled out, incinerated off-site per regulation, and the whole operation got logged as a line item nobody upstairs ever bothered reading twice. I asked her the obvious question, whether dead monsters counted the same way dead gear did. She didn't know. Neither did I, not for certain. The rule I'd built my whole understanding on said dead or broken matter, and a corpse was about as dead as matter got. But 3 weeks and I'd already learned that assuming anything about this system without testing it first was how a man lost a finger. So I went to look, because the alternative was wondering forever, and wondering had never once made me any money. The cull site was worse than she'd described and better than I'd hoped, both at once. A whole nest's worth of low-tier constructs, the kind the guild culled by the dozen and never bothered cataloging individually, stacked along a corridor wall in loose piles waiting on an incineration crew that clearly wasn't in any hurry to get down here. Beyond them, past a second collapse section Sasha had to clear a path through first, 3 larger bodies waited. Actual named class monsters, the sort that made it into a hunter's official report instead of a simple head count, killed clean enough that whoever did it hadn't bothered staying to loot properly before moving on to the next objective on their sheet. I set my hand against the nearest one and waited for the system to tell me I was wrong about all of it. Level, 11 to 13. Strength, 11 to 13. Vitality, 11 to 13. Perception, 11 to 13. Gold, 950,000. The jump was bigger than anything I'd ever pulled out of a room full of scavenged gear, dead already, which made the whole broken matter-only rule feel almost generous by comparison, since nobody had to break a monster first. Somebody else had already done that part, off the books, for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with me. My whole body jumped 2 levels in the same breath, the panel stacking faster than I could actually finish reading it, and the numbers sitting in that hidden account 2 districts overcrossed a full 1,000,000 gold for the first time since I'd started keeping any real track of it. Sasha whistled, low, the kind of sound that meant even she hadn't expected the number. Spend slow, spend quiet. Never once let the number on paper come anywhere close to matching the number that was actually true. I told her the same thing I always told her. Nothing, for now. Spend slow, spend quiet. Never once let the number on paper come anywhere close to matching the number that was actually true. She was already moving again before I'd finished saying it, deeper into the collapsed section, flashlight low, the particular careful walk she used whenever she wasn't fully sure what sat under her next step. I called after her that the cull site was cleared, that there wasn't anything left back there worth risking a second collapse on top of the first one. She didn't answer right away, and when she did, her voice had a different shape to it entirely. Flatter, tighter, the exact tone she only used when something genuinely surprised her, which by itself told me more than whatever she said next possibly could. There was a second chamber past the collapse. Sealed, not natural. Reinforced the way only guild engineering ever bothered reinforcing anything, and abandoned long enough that whatever sat stored inside it had gone from valuable to forgotten to, judging by the layer of dust caked across the outer seal, actively unlisted on any manifest anyone currently working here had ever laid eyes on. She'd gotten the door open maybe 6 inches before I even reached her, enough for one flashlight beam to cut through the gap, and nothing more. Full racks. She'd gotten the door open maybe 6 inches before I even reached her, enough for one flashlight beam to cut through the gap, and nothing more. Full racks. Not the scavenged, mismatched gear I hauled out of hoarders' dens by the cartload week after week. Matched sets. The same maker's mark stamped on every single piece she could see from the gap. The unmistakable clean lines of something built to a spec instead of assembled from whatever survived a fight. She didn't know armor well enough to call a rank number off one glance through 6 inches of gap, but she'd spent 3 weeks learning exactly what someone doesn't want this found looked like from every angle a person could look at it from. And this chamber had every single mark of that at once, stacked floor to ceiling and sealed twice over for good measure. She said the word S like it might get her in trouble just for saying it, and didn't move to pull the door open any further until I was standing right there beside her. I asked her what rank she thought it was, mostly because I already suspected the answer and wanted someone else to say it first. Hearing it out loud would make it a fact instead of just something I'd talked myself into. Sasha got the sealed door open the rest of the way while I held both flashlights, and the racks inside turned out to be exactly what 6 inches of gap had promised. 12 full sets, every strap and buckle still fastened the way a quartermaster leaves gear nobody ever collected, stamped with a maker's crest neither of us recognized. No bodies. No sign of a fight. Whatever unit this belonged to had simply never come back for it, and somebody with enough authority to seal a reinforced door had decided that was easier to bury than explain. I ran my palm along the nearest breastplate and let the system settle the argument. Liquidated, sealed S-rank armory cache to plus 10,500,000,000 bronze. Level, 13 to 16. Strength, 13 to 16. Vitality, 13 to 16. Perception, 13 to 16. A number that size didn't stack quietly, even though nobody outside my own head would ever see it move. It landed all at once, 3 levels in the space of one breath, and for the first time since I'd started leaving the system shop tab closed out of habit, the number sitting there stopped being an abstraction and became something I could actually use, entirely on my own terms. I opened the shop menu right there in the tunnel, a private interface only I could see, no receipt, no declared account anywhere a real auditor could pull a record of, nothing that ever touched an actual market or an actual bank, and spent enough bronze on raw stat points to push every number I owned well past where it had been standing an hour earlier. Small enough, quiet enough, entirely inside a system nobody else could even see existed. Stat allocation, strength/vitality/perception +6, system shop. The guild's own combat ladder didn't wait around to be asked. Whatever threshold it had been tracking on the other end, crossing it from the inside was apparently enough on its own. Combat ladder, F to E. I read it twice before it actually meant anything. Every day since the licensing hall, F had been sitting under my name the way a smell sits in a room you stop noticing, not a rank so much as a fact about who I was, filed next to human garbage disposal and never once expected to move. Sasha studied my face for a second, checking whether it was a joke, then shoved my shoulder hard enough that I had to catch the doorframe. "You actually bought your way up," she said, already grinning. "Gold, 2 million. 2 million. I stood there doing the same math I always did, converting the number in the vault into something that meant anything at all next to a life that still involved a sanitation card and a mockery nickname 3 floors of this building used without thinking twice. and for the first time the math didn't land as absurd. It landed as leverage I still wasn't using. Sasha wanted to celebrate immediately, and she wasn't interested in my usual argument about staying quiet. She'd been living on cart route rations and split pairs for 3 straight weeks right alongside me. And a rank up, she said, was exactly the kind of thing a man was allowed to be reckless about once. I found Bae on the way back up, still doing her end-of-shift walk of the third-floor corridors, clipboard against her hip out of habit more than need. I told her what happened before I'd even fully decided to. She stopped walking. Then she repeated the number back to me flat, testing whether saying it out loud made it feel any more real than it already had. Han-Joon, she said, do you understand what that actually does to your file? I didn't, not really. Ranks had always been something that happened to other people, the ones 2 stations over from mine at the licensing hall. She explained it faster than I could ask. Classy meant real assignment eligibility outside sanitation. Mint Park's office had to at least glance at a promotion form instead of shredding it unread. Meant a version of my life existed now that this building's own bureaucracy was obligated to acknowledge. The news beat me back to the 3rd floor anyway. Choi caught wind of it before I'd even clocked out. A rank up filed through the licensing office leaves a paper trail even a sanitation worker can't fully hide. And a man who'd spent 2 weeks building a case on my supposedly unremarkable output didn't take kindly to discovering the numbers underneath it had just cleared a hurdle his own crew hadn't touched in years. He didn't confront me directly. He didn't have to. Word came back through Sasha's usual channels that he'd gone very quiet in the break room, then very loud in Director Park's outer office, demanding to know how a human garbage disposal outranked half his own team before lunch. Sasha, when I told her, just shrugged and said Choi had never once been a real problem to begin with, only a loud one, and a loud man with no actual evidence was easier to ignore than most people gave him credit for. I told Bae I wasn't planning on using any of it yet, and she gave me a look that said she'd expected exactly that answer and had already decided not to fight me on it tonight. What she did insist on was dinner, and she wouldn't take the sanitation cafeteria as an answer. Sasha backed her immediately, which meant I lost 2 votes to 1 before I'd finished arguing my case. We ended up at a steakhouse 3 districts up from anywhere I'd ever eaten, the kind of place with a doorman and a wine list longer than my old rent agreement, the kind of place that would have laughed a sanitation jumpsuit straight back out onto the street a month ago. I paid for it in cash pulled from an account with a balance nobody at that table besides me could have named a real number for, and ordered the single most expensive cut on the menu without once looking at the price beside it. Sasha ate fast and without pretense, closer to actual hunger than either of us said out loud. Bae kept catching my eye across the table with an expression I still didn't fully have a name for, somewhere between pride and something warmer than pride. And every time our waiter refilled a glass he did it with a small, genuine deference, the exact opposite of 3 years spent learning to be invisible to men in aprons twice my age. 2 million gold. Classy hunter. A rank the guild's own system had just decided, without asking my permission, that it was obligated to notice, and a rival 3 floors down who'd just decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with any evidence he actually had, that this was personal now. The item that started it was a mana battery, one of a dozen crated up outside a decommissioned enchanting bay, and the crate's manifest tag read reserve stock, non-functional in a clerk's handwriting, so bored it barely qualified as legible. Nothing about it looked physically wrong. No crack, no scorch mark, no obvious damage a person could point to and name. I lifted one out anyway, curious more than hopeful, and turned it over looking for whatever the tag meant by non-functional. Sasha found me standing there with it, cartwheels squeaking to a stop somewhere behind her, and asked what exactly I thought I was going to do with a battery that had nothing wrong with it. I told her I didn't know yet, only that a battery this dry should have weighed less than it did in my hand, and put my palm flat against the casing to find out. The system answered before I'd finished the question. Liquidated. Depleted mana battery to plus 6 million bronze. 6 million, out of a single battery that hadn't so much as a scratch on it. I stood there running the number twice, because the whole architecture I'd built my understanding on, broken meant broken, cracked casings and snapped hilts and things that had visibly failed, had just quietly rewritten itself around a battery whose only crime was running dry. Functionally useless still counted. I checked the rest of the crate to make sure it wasn't a fluke. 11 more batteries, every one of them drained past whatever threshold the enchanting bay used to justify writing them off. Every one of them liquidated clean, no different from the first. Whatever line I'd been drawing for 3 weeks between broken and merely worthless had never actually existed. The system had never cared about the difference. Only I had. Sasha did the math out loud before I did, the way she always beat me to the number when it mattered. A whole wing of this building had to be full of exactly this. Nothing physically ruined, just spent, exhausted, quietly retired the moment it stopped pulling its weight, and left to sit, because nobody official had a reason to think it was worth anything at all. We spent the rest of the week finding out how right she was. Liquidated, decommissioned enchanting stock, bulk, to plus 29,993,999,956 bronze. Level, 16 to 25. Strength, 16 to 25. Vitality, 16 to 25. Perception, 16 to 25. Gold, 5 million. 9 levels in one sweep of a wing nobody had bothered auditing in years, and the number sitting in the account 2 districts overcrossed 5 million gold for the first time. I'd started this job 3 weeks ago converting a bent gauntlet into 2 bronze. I hadn't run out of new ways for the number to keep multiplying since. It was Bay who called sanitation down to the sub-basement, not for anything related to what we'd already found, but for a leak nobody in maintenance could explain. Mana pressure readings off across half the sublevel, the kind of anomaly the guild usually blamed on old plumbing until someone got hurt proving it wasn't. The rumor already circulating by the time I got there called it cursed. A cursed relic, buried somewhere down there, bleeding instability into the walls. I found it wedged behind a support column an hour into the search, an old warding stone. Its containment lattice fractured along one edge in a way that would have been obvious if anyone had bothered to actually look instead of repeating the word cursed at each other in the break room. Not cursed. Broken, the ordinary kind this time. Cracked clean enough that even Choi could have spotted it from across the room if he'd ever once shown up to check. "You're sure that's it?" Bay said, crouched beside me, close enough that I could feel her doubt. I was sure. I put my hand against the lattice and let the system confirm it for both of us. Liquidated. Fractured warding stone to plus 1,200,000,000 bronze. Gold, 5,120,000. The pressure readings dropped to nothing within the minute, and a leak the guild's own engineers hadn't managed to diagnose in 3 days quietly stopped existing, closed by a sanitation worker nobody in that building had ever once thought to ask, holding a stone that was never cursed at all. The salvage crew that cleared out the old proving grounds 3 levels down left behind exactly what you'd expect from a testing range nobody had used in a decade, a field of shattered target dummies, cracked stone pillars scarred from 1,000 missed strikes, and a rack of practice weapons so dulled and warped from overuse that even a collector would have called them firewood. Nobody official had bothered clearing it, because nobody official thought there was a single bronze in the whole field worth the trip. I walked the length of it once, hand trailing along every ruined surface I passed, and let the system decide who was right. Liquidated, abandoned proving grounds, bulk, to plus 48,800,000,000 bronze. Level, 25 to 31. Strength, 25 to 31. Vitality, 25 to 31. Perception, 25 to 31. Gold, 10 million. 10 million. A decade of a guild throwing away broken training equipment had just handed me more wealth than most licensed hunters saw in a career, and none of it had cost me anything but the walk down there and back. I stood in the wreckage a while longer than I needed to, doing the same math I always did, and for the first time the disbelief had already given way to a plan half-formed. I knew exactly what I wanted to spend some of it on. Yuna had been stuck at trainee for 3 months, not for lack of skill. Everyone on the healer wing said the same thing about her hands: quiet, precise, better than her rank had any right to be, but for lack of the one thing talent alone never bought, the actual resources a journeyman needed to test into the rank. Reagents, a proper focus crystal, the registration fee itself, none of it cheap, all of it locked behind a rank she couldn't afford to reach. I'd been quietly covering small pieces of it for weeks, an anonymous donation here, a clerical adjustment to a resource requisition there, small enough that nobody ever thought to ask where it came from. 10 million gold changed the scale of what small could mean. I routed the money the same way I always did, through 3 separate accounts that had never once heard of each other, ending at a Healer Guild resource fund with a donor field that simply read Anonymous Benefactor. Enough for the reagents. Enough for a focus crystal 2 grades above what she'd been training on. Enough, with room left over, that the registration fee wouldn't even register as a real expense against it. Sasha found me afterward in the usual stairwell, arms crossed, studying my face with the particular expression she used when she already knew the answer and wanted to hear me say it anyway. "You just bought her whole test," she said. I told her I hadn't bought anything. I'd made a donation. There was a difference, technically, and the difference was the only reason nobody would ever trace it back to a sanitation worker 3 floors down from the wing it landed in. Word moved through the healer wing faster than either of us expected. By the following week, Yuna had already sat her journeyman trial and passed it clean. First attempt, no retest needed, and the story going around wasn't really about the promotion itself so much as the mystery attached to it. An anonymous donor covering a full journeyman kit for a trainee nobody upstairs had ever bothered sponsoring, the kind of thing that simply didn't happen without a reason nobody could name. Healers who'd never once spoken to her started stopping by her station to congratulate her. A senior journeyman asked, only half joking, whether she had a wealthy secret admirer. I heard about it from Bae, who heard about it from 3 separate people before lunch, all of them repeating the same theory with a different guess attached to it each time. Bae told me some people were saying it was Director Park, buying goodwill after the audit, peeling a pear with the kind of focus that meant she found the whole thing funnier than she was letting on. I said that was exactly the kind of thing Park would want people to think, and left it there. Yuna herself found me on my usual afternoon round 2 days later, healer's badge freshly upgraded, and thanked me for something I'd never officially done. She still thought of me as the sanitation worker who'd been kind to her back when nobody else on this floor bothered learning her name. Nothing more than that, and I let her keep thinking it. She talked for a full 5 minutes about a mentor she'd finally been assigned, about techniques she could only learn at journeyman and above, about a future that had opened up in front of her overnight for reasons she still couldn't fully explain. I told her I was happy for her. That part, at least, wasn't anything I had to fake. By the end of the week, the talk of the healer wing wasn't about the promotion anymore. It was about the donor nobody could name, and how badly half the department wanted to find out who they were. Guild HQ's restricted archive wing wasn't sanitation's problem, technically. Nothing filed under seized, pending review ever crossed a sanitation cart's manifest, which was exactly why I noticed it the one time it did. A training golem's core, half its housing sheared clean off, sitting on a supply requisition sheet that should have routed straight to disposal and instead got redirected 2 floors up with a stamp I'd never seen before. Someone with real authority had decided a piece of broken junk was worth locking behind a door instead of handing it to the one man in this building who'd have turned it into money inside a minute. I mentioned it to Sasha the way I mention most things that bothered me lately, half a complaint, half thinking out loud. She got quiet for a beat, the particular kind of quiet she got whenever a locked door offended her personally, and admitted she'd had the archive wings guard rotation memorized for 2 months already. She'd just never had a use for it before tonight. We went at the shift change, the 10-minute window twice a day when the day guard signed off and the night crew hadn't finished their coffee, a gap she swore had existed since the wing was built. She didn't need me to fight anything, which was good, since fighting had never once been the plan. She needed me quiet, patient, and willing to stand still in a blind angle for 4 straight minutes while a guard walked past close enough to touch. She counted the corridor out loud under her breath before we ever reached it. Left at the junction, not right. The right-hand camera had a 3-second sweep gap every 90 seconds, and she already had the rhythm of it memorized down to the second. Wait here, not there. The floor creaked 2 tiles over, something she'd learned the hard way on a run that had nothing to do with tonight. A supply closet door she'd rather I not open, not because there was danger behind it, only because opening it would cost us 4 seconds we didn't have to spare. She never once explained the reasoning before she'd already moved past it. I asked her, once, in a whisper, how a woman who'd never worked a single shift in this wing knew it better than anyone who actually did. People stop seeing a place after the first month, she whispered back. She never stopped seeing anything. The seized items room was smaller than the locked door had promised, and worse organized. Shelves of confiscated junk nobody had looked at twice since it landed there. A dented ceremonial blade with no scabbard, a crate of unlabeled vials gone cloudy with age, a stack of guild forms someone had bothered to seize, but never bothered to file. The golem core sat exactly where the requisition sheet said it would, tagged, sealed, forgotten, on a shelf all its own, set apart from everything else in the room the way something clearly gets set apart once whoever filed it understood exactly what it was worth. I read the tag before I touched anything. Prototype combat frame, decommissioned after a training accident, cause of failure marked under review 11 months ago. Whatever review that was, it had clearly stopped happening a long time before tonight. I put my hand against the cracked housing and let the system settle an argument nobody in this building even knew was being had. Liquidated, seized prototype combat core to plus 50 billion bronze. Level, 31 to 36. Strength, 31 to 36. Vitality, 31 to 36. Perception, 31 to 36. Gold, 15 million. That total, sitting there in a room small enough that I could have touched every wall in it without moving my feet, didn't feel real for a second. Sasha allowed herself exactly one low whistle at the number stacking over my shoulder, then crouched down and put the golem core's tag back exactly where the requisition sheet said it belonged, sealing the empty shelf the way we'd found it. She straightened up, looked at the bare space where the core had sat, and asked me whether I'd noticed the difference between tonight and every other room we'd cleared. I hadn't, not until she said it. Every other job had been junk nobody official had ever bothered claiming. This was the first thing we'd taken that the guild had actually locked a door over on purpose, and neither of us had any real idea yet how long it would take somebody upstairs to notice the lock hadn't held. Choi's investigation into me had quietly died sometime after my rank cleared his own crew's ceiling, but the reputation he'd spent 2 weeks building never went anywhere. Human garbage disposal was still the name half this building used without thinking twice, and for 3 weeks I'd simply absorbed it, a cost of doing business I never once questioned. It took Bae, of all people, to point out I'd been thinking about it backward. She caught me during a shift change, cartwheels squeaking, and asked whether I'd noticed nobody important had ever once lowered their voice around me. I hadn't, not until she said it out loud. I started testing it the next morning, small and deliberate. I took the executive wing's cleaning rotation whenever it came open, the one nobody else on the crew wanted because it meant an hour of mopping floors outside offices that never had anything worth stealing. I kept my head down, my expression blank, my pace exactly as slow as everyone already assumed it was, and let every conversation in that hallway run right past me. Background noise nobody thought twice about producing in front of a mop. Twice that first week, a junior auditor complained loudly about a budget shortfall 3 feet from where I was working, never once glancing my direction. A department head argued with someone on the phone about a shipment that had gone missing between 2 warehouses, voice sharp enough to carry through 2 closed doors, and never once lowered it for the man on his knees scrubbing a coffee stain out of the carpet 10 feet away. I learned more about how this building actually ran in that first week of deliberate mopping than I had in 3 months of genuinely trying to understand it. I'd started keeping a mental ledger of exactly who. The cover had a cost, and the cost showed up on day 4 in the shape of a junior auditor named Song who apparently found nothing funnier than a man too slow to know he was being made fun of. He started narrating my own work back to me in exaggerated small words, congratulating me on successfully identifying a mop as a mop, asking his colleagues in a stage whisper whether I understood what a floor was. I let him. I nodded along at the wrong moments on purpose, asked which end of the mop was supposed to touch the ground, and watched 3 separate people nearly choke on their coffee, trying not to laugh in front of him. Song walked away thoroughly pleased with himself, having just spent 4 minutes explaining basic cleaning supplies to a man quietly worth more gold than the entire executive wing combined, and never once suspected he'd been the one performing. The executive wing's supply closet, it turned out, held more than mop buckets. A cracked resonance amplifier, the kind conference rooms used to project a speaker's voice across a hall, had been shoved behind a shelf of cleaning chemicals for who knew how long, its casing split down one side. I put my hand against it on my way past, quiet, unhurried, exactly the pace a man too dim to be interesting would move at. Liquidated, cracked resonance amplifier to plus 50 billion bronze. Level, 36 to 41. Strength, 36 to 41. Vitality, 36 to 41. Perception, 36 to 41. Gold, 20 million. 20 million, and not one person in that hallway had looked at me twice while it happened. Director Park's office door was never fully soundproofed, a detail I doubted anyone had ever bothered testing since nobody who mattered had reason to stand outside it mopping. I found that reason on a Thursday, parked directly outside with a bucket and a rag, moving in the same slow half circles I'd been moving in all week, while Park's voice carried through the gap under the door clearer than either of us apparently realized it could. He wasn't reviewing my performance metrics. He wasn't talking about audits or Choi or anything that had ever crossed my desk. He was talking to someone I didn't recognize about a relic, a specific one, missing from a guild inventory that should never have gone missing anything at all. And whatever this relic actually was, Park's voice carried a weight I'd never once heard him use discussing anything in sanitation's direction. Whoever he was talking to asked a question I couldn't make out through the door. Park's answer came back flat and immediate, the tone of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to end before it started. "Nobody outside this office knows it's gone," he said. "Keep it that way." The other voice said something else I couldn't catch, quieter this time, and Park's reply carried an edge I'd never heard him use on anyone, ever, in 3 weeks of watching him tear into supervisors half his rank for far smaller mistakes. I kept mopping. I didn't slow down, didn't speed up, didn't do anything a dim-witted sanitation worker wouldn't have done standing exactly where I was standing, bucket at my feet, rag in my hand, eyes fixed on a coffee stain that had stopped needing my attention 2 minutes ago. But I heard every word of it. 20 million gold sitting untouched in an account nobody official knew existed had stopped feeling secure. Bronze I could spend in pieces small enough to vanish into an ordinary sanitation worker's life. A donation here, a covered fee there, nothing that ever added up to a shape anyone could point to. 3 weeks of liquidating the guild's forgotten wreckage had gotten me wealth. It hadn't gotten me anything I could actually stand inside. Sasha found the building the way she found most things worth finding, by walking a block often enough to notice nobody else ever did. 3 stories, boarded windows, a section of roof collapsed inward, condemned by the city, so long ago the notice on the door had faded past reading. Weeds had worked their way up through cracks in the entrance steps thick enough to suggest years, not months, of nobody bothering to trim them back. A rusted delivery sign still hung crooked over the old loading dock, advertising a business that had presumably closed decades before either of us was born. I asked her why she'd bothered remembering a building nobody else cared about. She said she remembered every building nobody cared about, on principle, because sooner or later one of them always mattered. I told her that wasn't a principle, it was a habit she'd never once stopped to question. She didn't argue the point. I bought it through the same 3 accounts I routed everything else through, a sum modest enough against 20 million that nobody at the property registry would think twice about a small-time buyer's money. No mask, no declared fortune, just paperwork quiet enough to disappear into the district's other abandoned lots. The clerk stamped 3 forms without reading past the first line of any of them, processing my ownership with the kind of efficiency usually reserved for denying a permit. Sasha stood in what had once been a lobby, testing a floorboard with the toe of her boot before trusting it with her weight. "I like it already," she admitted, unprompted. She didn't say why. I didn't ask. I said I hadn't decided yet what it was for. The smell reached us on the 2nd floor before anything else did, wet and organic. More rot than a collapsed roof alone should have produced in any reasonable span of years. Sasha's hand found the knife at her belt before either of us said a word about it, the particular quiet settling over her that meant she'd already stopped assuming this building was simply empty. We found the source in what had been a storage room. A nest, pale and insectal, dozens of them clustered thick across the far wall, feeding on rot nobody had disturbed in longer than either of us wanted to guess. "Not dangerous," Sasha said after a full minute of watching them ignore her presence entirely, "but not nothing either. Low tier." I asked her how long she thought it had been feeding down here, undisturbed, nobody the wiser. She didn't know, not exactly, and for once neither of us tried to guess out loud. The rot beneath the nest ran deep enough into the floorboards that whatever this room had originally stored, the building's own decay had long since swallowed any trace of it. Sasha crouched at the doorway, studying the collapse pattern of the section she'd need to bring down, running the same silent calculation she ran before every controlled demolition she'd ever walked me through. She asked whether I trusted her math. I told her I always did, and meant it, the same way I'd meant it every other time she'd put something heavier than either of us between herself and a room full of things that hadn't asked permission to be there. She didn't smile at that, not exactly, but something in her shoulders loosened, the particular give she allowed herself only when she already knew a plan was going to work before the first move ever happened. Sasha didn't fight them directly. She lured the whole cluster into a single collapsed section of the room with a sealed ration she'd been saving for exactly this kind of use, backing us both into the doorway while the insects converged on the bait exactly the way she'd predicted they would. She timed the strike to the second, one controlled hit against a support beam already halfway to failing, and stepped clear of the falling debris before I'd even finished registering that the ceiling had actually started to give. None of them had survived the collapse. I hadn't personally raised a hand against a single one, and the system, when I finally put my palm against the wreckage, didn't seem to care about that distinction at all. Liquidated, nest infestation, bulk, to plus 300 billion bronze. Level, 41 to 47. Strength, 41 to 47. Vitality, 41 to 47. Perception, 41 to 47. Gold, 50 million. 50 million. Out of a building the city itself had forgotten it still held records for. Sasha crouched by the collapsed section of floor to check the rest of the debris hadn't hidden a second nest underneath the first, and went still in a way that had nothing to do with insects at all. Cut into the foundation beneath the wreckage, half buried under 2 decades of settled dust, sat a second door. Sealed. No requisition tag, no seized property stamp, nothing on it at all to explain why a 3-story wreck nobody wanted had a second locked door built directly into its own foundation, reinforced in a way that had nothing in common with the rest of this building's cheap, decaying construction. Sasha ran her fingers along the seam where the door met the surrounding concrete, testing it the same careful way she'd tested every other lock we'd ever gone through together, and didn't say a word for a long moment. Choi cornered me in the break room that morning before I'd even had my coffee, waving a clipboard like it was evidence in a trial only he'd been told was happening. He'd apparently spent his entire weekend cross-referencing 3 months of my sanitation output against the crew average, convinced he'd finally found the pattern that would get me busted back down to whatever rank he thought I actually deserved. He read the numbers out loud to the whole break room, playing prosecutor to a case nobody else in the room had agreed to hear, got 2 of the 3 columns backward, and had to be corrected, twice, by a junior clerk half his age who looked more embarrassed for him than he was for himself. Nobody laughed out loud. Everybody wanted to. The assignment sheet Bay handed me an hour later had the wrong dungeon code on it, or at least that was the only explanation either of us could come up with afterward. Sub-basement debris cleanup, it read, standard sanitation sweep following a guild-confirmed clear. What it didn't say, because whoever filed it had apparently transposed 2 digits without checking, was that the dungeon in question had been cleared by an A-rank party the night before, and nobody had bothered updating the hazard classification before routing the cleanup order down to sanitation. Bay herself hadn't caught it either, distracted by 3 other sheets stacked on top of it and a shift already running long, and by the time either of us thought to double-check the code against the day's actual clearance log, we were already 2 floors down and past the point where turning back would have cost more than just walking in and finding out. Sasha caught the mistake before I did. Standing at the entrance with a scanner reading numbers she'd never seen a sanitation assignment carry before. She asked whether I wanted to turn around and report the error, the way any reasonable person actually would. I asked her whether a sane person left A-rank kill sites unliquidated out of an excess of caution. She didn't answer that directly. "Stay close," she said, checking her gear a second time, in case this floor still had something in it neither of us was ready for. The corridor leading in still carried the marks of whatever fight had cleared it, scorched stone, deep gouges cut into the walls at heights no human arm could have reached, a burnt, metallic tang in the air that hadn't fully dissipated yet. The dungeon floor beyond the entrance was a battlefield, in the plainest possible sense, 12 hours settled, but still a battlefield. 3 named class monsters lay where the clearing party had left them, bodies the size of transport vehicles, untouched by anyone since the official clear, because A-rank cleanup crews worked on a different schedule than sanitation did, and nobody had thought to rush the paperwork. Cracked stone pillars, half a wall blown clean through, a scorch pattern across the ceiling wide enough to suggest whatever fight had happened here had gone up as much as it had gone sideways. Whatever the guild's actual salvage teams were going to eventually extract from a kill site this size, they hadn't gotten to it yet, and I had a hand and an ability that didn't care whose schedule I was interrupting. Sasha walked the perimeter twice before she'd let me get close to any of the bodies, checking every shadow the collapsed section of ceiling threw across the floor, checking twice more when the first pass turned up nothing. "Clear," she said finally, though she said it the way a person says a word they don't entirely trust. in a room where the definition of clear had already been proven wrong once today. I asked her which one she was betting on. She said she'd rather not find out the hard way, and moved to cover the doorway instead of answering directly, close enough to the exit that we could both still make it if her read on the room turned out to be wrong. Only once she'd finished a third slow scan of every corner did she finally wave me forward. I put my palm against the nearest one before Sasha finished her second full sweep of the chamber. Liquidated. A rank named class remains ×3 to plus 2,500 billion bronze. Level 47 to 58. Strength 47 to 58. Vitality 47 to 58. Perception 47 to 58. Gold 300 million. 300 million. Out of a mistake in a filing system that would probably never even get corrected before the next shift buried it under 100 other clerical errors. 3 transposed digits doing more for me in one morning than 3 straight weeks of deliberate liquidation ever had. I'd crossed more wealth in the last 4 minutes than every liquidation before it combined. I opened the system shop right there on the dungeon floor and spent without hesitating. The way I'd been telling myself for months I eventually would once the number finally justified it. Rank purchase first, every stat point I could reasonably push through in one sitting. The combat ladder shifting under me for the second time since I'd started keeping track. Combat ladder, E to D. The rest went on something I'd been quietly pricing out for weeks without ever committing to buying it. Masked identity gear. Full disguise-grade concealment built for exactly the purpose its name implied. 150 million gold gone in a single confirmed purchase, more than I'd spent on anything else combined since the day I'd first learned what my own hand could do to broken metal. I'd read the shop listing a dozen times over the last month without ever letting myself confirm it, telling myself each time that the number still hadn't earned the purchase yet. That spending this much before I had this much to spend felt like tempting a system that had never once needed tempting. The interface didn't just confirm the purchase. It rendered the item directly into my hands. A mask and a set of matched gear folded so precisely I couldn't tell where the fabric ended and the enchantment began, weightless in a way nothing this substantial had any right to be. Gold, 150 million. Sasha watched me turn the mask over in my hands afterward, saying nothing, the particular quiet she used when she already knew what I was about to say before I said it. "You're going to start doing this on purpose," she said eventually. Not a question. I told her that was the plan, or the closest thing to one I'd managed to put together in the last 5 minutes. She asked whether I'd thought through what happened the first time someone official actually saw a masked, unranked hunter clearing a dungeon nobody had assigned him to. I hadn't. Not fully. Not yet. And I told her that too, because lying to her about it had never once worked out better than the truth would have. I wasn't planning on waiting for another filing error to hand me the next A-rank site. If the guild's own hunters could clear dungeons for a living, there was no rule anywhere in that system shop that said a sanitation worker couldn't do the exact same thing. Off the books, wearing a face nobody in this building had ever seen before, on a schedule that answered to nobody but me and the number I was chasing. The mask went on for the first time 3 nights after I bought it, in a maintenance stairwell 2 levels below where any camera in this building actually reached. Sasha had scouted the route twice, timed the patrol gaps to the second, and still insisted on walking the first 100 meters beside me anyway. Close enough that if the disguise failed for any reason at all, at least one competent person would be standing there to explain what had gone wrong. It didn't fail. The interface confirmed the swap the instant the mask settled into place, a full identity layer overriding whatever a passerby's eyes would report back to their own brain. And after 3 weeks of quietly stacking a fortune nobody official had any idea existed, I finally looked like someone the guild had never once filed paperwork on. Sasha studied me for a long moment under the stairwell's dim emergency lighting, the particular scrutiny She gave anything she hadn't fully trusted yet. "You don't look like you," she said. "Not just the face, the way you're standing." I said that was probably the point. She admitted it still unsettled her a little, watching someone she knew that well disappear into someone she'd never met, and I admitted the same thing was true on my end, because I hadn't fully gotten used to it either. I turned my hands over in front of the stairwell's dim light, half expecting them to look different too, and they didn't, which somehow unsettled me more than if they had. The dungeon I'd picked for a first run was deliberately unambitious, a low-tier site 3 districts out that the guild's own hunter boards rated barely worth the transit fare, chosen specifically because whatever happened tonight, it wouldn't be happening somewhere with real stakes attached. I'd spent 3 years watching hunters half my new stat totals walk into sites exactly like this one and walk back out laughing about how easy it had been. I wanted to find out, on my own terms, in a building nobody official was watching, whether laughing about it would be an option for me too. Sasha peeled off at the transit station 2 blocks from the entrance, the agreed limit of how far she was willing to shadow a run she wasn't actually part of. She made me repeat the extraction plan back to her a second time before finally waving me on alone, unimpressed with how casually I'd apparently been treating a first solo run into anything, low tier or not. I told her I'd survived 3 weeks of liquidating monster corpses with my bare hands before I'd ever bought a single stat point, and she reminded me, flatly, that none of those corpses had been capable of noticing me coming. It was, immediately, almost embarrassingly so. The first construct that came at me in the entrance corridor, a low-tier stone golem the hunter boards listed as a solid 10-minute fight for a properly ranked party, went down the moment I closed the distance and put my fist through the crystal core seated in its chest. Stat points I'd bought in bulk over 3 weeks of liquidation windfalls turned out to translate into raw physical force in a way no amount of theoretical math had fully prepared me for. I didn't have technique. I didn't have training or form or any of the things a real hunter spent years building. I had numbers large enough that technique stopped being the deciding factor, and for a low-tier site like this one, numbers alone were more than enough. I cleared the rest of the floor in under 20 minutes, mostly by walking toward whatever moved and letting the stat totals do work no amount of skill could have matched at this rank. 3 more constructs, a cluster of lesser beasts nesting in a collapsed side chamber, one genuinely unpleasant thing with too many limbs that I liquidated the moment it stopped moving instead of examining too closely. None of it required strategy. None of it required the years of drilled reflex every hunter board profile I'd ever read insisted was the actual price of entry into this line of work. I'd skipped every step that supposedly mattered and arrived at the same result anyway, and standing in the wreckage of the 4th kill, I still hadn't decided whether that made the whole system feel broken or just honest about what it had always actually rewarded. Liquidated, low-tier dungeon constructs and remains, bulk, to plus 500 billion bronze. Level, 58 to 63. Strength, 58 to 63. Vitality, 58 to 63. Perception, 58 to 63. Gold, 200 million. 200 million, and a dungeon that would show up on the guild's own boards tomorrow morning as officially cleared by someone. I stood in the entrance chamber afterward, mask still on, breathing harder than the fight itself had actually demanded, and understood for the first time exactly what Sasha had meant about not recognizing the way I was standing. The guild's automated logging system caught the clear the moment I stepped back through the entrance ward, the same passive registration every dungeon site carried regardless of who walked through it. I hadn't planned around that detail carefully enough, too focused on whether the mask itself would hold up to actually watch what the exit ward was quietly recording behind me the whole time. I found out what it had recorded the next morning, secondhand, from Bay, who'd heard it from someone in the licensing office who'd heard it from someone closer to Park's own desk. A low-tier site had come back, cleared overnight with no registered hunter attached to it at all, just a single flagged line where a name should have been, and Director Park, who apparently reviewed every night's automated log before he did anything else, had reportedly spent a full 20 minutes on that one entry before moving on to the rest of his morning. They didn't know what the flagged line actually said. I did. I'd seen it myself, reflected for half a second in the exit ward status display before I'd pulled the mask off and let the corridor swallow me back into being nobody worth a second look. Cleared, unknown. Bay relayed the rest of the story with the particular relish of someone passing along office gossip that didn't touch her personally, unaware she was describing my own night back to me almost beat for beat. 20 minutes was a long time for Park specifically to stare at one line on a routine log, she said, longer than he usually spent on anything that didn't already have a name attached to blame. I agreed that did sound unusual, and went back to my cart before either of us said anything that might have made the coincidence sitting in my chest a little too visible on my face. Sasha had been running solo reconnaissance for 3 years before I ever met her, which meant 3 years of doing the exact work I'd started asking her to do for me on gear she'd scavenged, patched, and repatched long after any reasonable person would have retired it. I noticed the state of her boots first, resoled twice by hand in a way that only barely still counted as waterproof, then the stealth cloak she wore on every serious run, thin enough in 3 separate places that I was fairly sure a determined flashlight beam could have found her through it. She never once mentioned any of it herself. I only noticed because I'd started paying attention to the same kind of detail she'd been reading off other people's clothes and posture for years without ever once explaining how she did it. I asked her, carefully, whether she'd ever actually priced out replacing any of it. She said the good stuff cost more than a sanitation cart's entire annual budget, and she'd made peace with patching what she already had a long time before I'd ever crossed her path with a number large enough to change that math. I didn't say anything about it for a week. I just started pricing out what actual guild-grade stealth equipment cost on the open market, then what it cost through the same quiet channels I routed everything else through, and the gap between those two numbers turned out to be the smallest problem in the whole equation. The larger problem, once I'd cleared out another mis-scheduled cleanup site the mask let me work without anyone official ever connecting it to a sanitation card, was that I'd never actually given Sasha anything before. Money, sure, split evenly the handful of times we'd talked about it, but never a gift, never something bought specifically because I'd noticed she needed it and decided that mattered more than whatever else the gold could have gone toward. Liquidated, cleared site remains, bulk, to plus 1,500 billion bronze. Level, 63 to 70. Strength, 63 to 70. Vitality, 63 to 70. Perception, 63 to 70. I spent the entire Windfall in one sitting, which I hadn't fully planned on doing until I was already 3 items deep into the guild's highest stealth gear tier, and realized stopping partway would have meant giving her something almost as good instead of something actually good. Full concealment weave, sensor-dampening boots rated for equipment 2 ranks above anything she'd ever worked with. A cloak that the shop listing swore could fool passive scanning entirely rather than just slowing it down. I read every specification twice before confirming, cross-checked the listing against 3 other vendors just to make sure I wasn't paying a markup for a name, and only stopped comparing prices when I realized I was stalling, still treating this gift as one more transaction to optimize instead of something that was allowed to simply cost what it cost. Gold, 350 million. I gave it to her in the same stairwell where I'd first put the mask on. No ceremony, just a bag set down on the step between us. You didn't have to do this, she said, already pulling the cloak out to check the stitching, running her thumb along every seam the way she checked any piece of gear before she'd trust it with her life. I told her I knew that already, and that it was exactly why I'd done it. She didn't argue the point any further, which from Sasha counted as something close to gratitude. She tried the gear that same night, on a guild sensor array in the sub-basement that had clocked her on every previous run she'd ever attempted past it, the one piece of infrastructure in this whole building she'd never once managed to slip. I watched from the corridors far in while she walked the length of it in full view of the array, twice, deliberately slow the second pass just to be certain, and the readout stayed flat both times, registering nothing. Not even the ambient heat signature a person that close should have thrown off. 3 years of trying to beat that one array, by her own count, and it had taken her exactly 2 purchases and 1 confident stride to finally manage it. She checked the display herself, voice pitched somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of something closer to delight, and told me it was reading nothing at all, that she could stand right on top of the array and it wouldn't know she existed. I asked her how that felt, 3 years into never once managing exactly that. She kept watching the flat readout a while longer, like it might change its mind if she looked away too soon, before finally admitting that the version of her who'd started this work alone, patching a stealth cloak by hand in a room nobody else knew existed, wouldn't have believed this display if someone had described it to her back then. I believed it. I'd watched the number confirm it twice now, and numbers, whatever else I'd learned about this system over the last 2 months, had never once lied to me yet. 3 years of patched gear and careful footwork had gotten her close, again and again, without ever quite closing the last gap between good and invisible. 350 million gold had closed it in a single evening, and neither of us said out loud how strange that math felt, standing there in a corridor that no longer knew either of us existed. What neither of us knew yet, standing there watching a display that refused to register her at all, was whether a sensor array going permanently blind in one corridor was the kind of anomaly that stayed quiet forever, or the kind that eventually got someone's attention the moment a routine calibration check turned up a dead zone with no mechanical reason to exist. The quota memo went up on the sanitation board on a Monday, and signed in any way that made it clear who'd actually authorized it, doubling every crew's weekly output requirement effective immediately, framed as a building-wide efficiency initiative in language that fooled nobody who'd worked here longer than a month. Bay read it twice before saying anything, then said, flatly, that this was Park finding a bureaucratic way to squeeze someone without ever having to name who, since a rule applied to the whole crew couldn't technically be called retaliation against just one worker in it. Nobody else on the crew seemed especially bothered. A doubled quota was an inconvenience for people who weren't already spending half their nights somewhere else entirely, and for everyone but me. That was exactly what this was. I didn't need her to spell out who that one worker probably was. A normal week's rotation ran 4 routes, 2 bins per route, tools checked out at the start of shift and checked back in at the end, supply counts logged against the manifest before anyone clocked out. Doubling the quota meant 8 routes instead of 4, for bins instead of 2, the same tool locker, and the same manifest sheet now expected to absorb twice the traffic without a single extra hour added anywhere to make room for it. The timing could not have landed worse. 3 weeks into running mass jobs on top of a full sanitation schedule, I was already sleeping less than I'd have admitted to anyone who asked, and a doubled quota on top of moonlighting that already ran past midnight most nights left almost no margin anywhere in the week for either job to actually get done properly. I tried the honest approach for exactly 2 days, working sanitation shifts at genuine full effort and running dungeon sites afterward on whatever energy was left over. And by the second night, I understood with total clarity that this math simply didn't close no matter how I arranged it. Sasha noticed before I said anything about it, the way she noticed most things I hadn't gotten around to admitting yet, watching me nearly walk into a support column on our way out of a low-tier site that should have taken 10 minutes and had taken closer to 25 because I'd stopped moving with any real precision somewhere around the second floor. "You look like you're running on fumes," she said, and she wasn't exaggerating for effect. I told her the quota increase was eating every hour I used to have to spare, that sanitation and moonlighting had somehow both stopped fitting into the same 24 hours no matter how I rearranged them, no matter how many corners I tried cutting on sleep instead of on either job itself. She asked, reasonably, why I was still doing sanitation work by hand at all, given everything else I'd apparently learned how to buy over the last 3 weeks. I didn't have a good answer for that. I'd simply never considered it. 3 years of doing the job with my own 2 hands so deeply ingrained that the idea of doing it any other way hadn't once crossed my mind, even after everything else about my life had already changed completely. Somewhere in the gap between the man who'd started this job and whatever I was now, I'd apparently kept doing sanitation the old way purely out of habit, the same way a person keeps taking the long route home years after a shorter one gets built. It took me one more exhausted, half-conscious shift to actually test what she'd suggested. Strength and perception, purchased in bulk over 3 weeks of liquidation windfalls, translated into raw sanitation output the same way they translated into dungeon clearing force, and once I actually let myself move at the speed my own purchase stats allowed rather than the pace 3 years of habit had trained into me, a full week's assigned quota took less than 10 minutes to physically complete. Bins that used to take a full arm and back to shift, I lifted one-handed without noticing the weight at all, 3 at a time where I used to manage 1. My cart, rated for a load I'd never once come close to testing before tonight, filled past its marked capacity twice over and still rolled easy under the new numbers. I cleared every sub-level route on my usual rotation in one continuous pass instead of the normal 3 separate trips, refilled my cart twice from the tool locker without slowing down, and never once hit the point where my own arms would normally have forced a rest break just to keep pushing the cart another level down. By the end of the shift, I'd counted 6 full cart loads hauled and logged against a normal week's average of 2. Every route on my rotation checked off in order. Every tool back on its hook. Every bin counted, weighed, and matched against the manifest before I clocked out. Liquidated, assorted sanitation backlog, bulk, to plus 1,500 billion bronze. Level, 70 to 76. Strength, 70 to 76. Vitality, 70 to 76. Perception, 70 to 76. Gold, 500 million. 500 million, mostly from junk I'd been walking past without liquidating for 3 years out of nothing more than habit, once I actually started moving fast enough to notice how much of it there really was. 3 years of assuming I already knew what this building's basements had to offer, and it turned out I'd simply never moved fast enough to actually see it all in one pass. I filed the completed quota report that same afternoon, a full week's assigned tonnage logged and verified in a single shift, and went home to actually sleep for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The report landed on Park's desk the next morning, and by every account Bay could piece together afterward, he didn't celebrate a sanitation worker suddenly hitting impossible numbers. He flagged it. A tenfold productivity spike from a crew he'd spent months building a case against for the opposite reason was, in his read of it, not good news. It was evidence of something he hadn't identified yet. Bay said he'd pulled 3 weeks of my prior quota records for comparison before lunch, then pulled the district's dungeon clearance logs right after, 2 entirely separate investigations that had never once occurred to him to run side by side, and had no obvious reason to connect. A sanitation worker whose weekly output had suddenly quintupled overnight, no explanation attached. A masked hunter with no registered identity clearing sites that should have been well beyond a solo operator. Filed in the same mental drawer, unconnected to me, unconnected to each other, but both now occupying real space in the attention of a man whose entire career ran on noticing exactly the kind of pattern I'd just handed him for free. The freeze notice showed up on my public account balance without warning, A single administrative hold flagged against a sanitation worker's routine wages, no explanation attached beyond a case number, and a note that the account was under review pending verification of income sources. I'd expected Park to eventually make some kind of move once the quota anomaly and the masked hunter's clearance logs both landed on his desk in the same week. I hadn't expected him to go after the one account that actually mattered least. I read the notice 3 times looking for a deeper threat buried underneath the bureaucratic language, some hint that he'd actually found something real, a thread connecting the sanitation worker to the mask to the ghost account, any of it. There wasn't one. It was exactly what it looked like, an official fishing expedition against a low-ranked worker whose numbers had suddenly stopped making sense, cast wide, because Park had nothing specific yet to aim at. My public balance held maybe 40,000 bronze on a good week, the ordinary wages of an ordinary sanitation worker, exactly the number that had made Choi's whole 2-week investigation such a waste of his time. Everything real sat 2 districts over, in a ghost account with no name attached that Park had no idea existed, and, if the freeze notice's language was any indication, hadn't come anywhere close to finding. Still, 40,000 bronze frozen meant 40,000 bronze I couldn't openly touch, and a man supposedly living on a sanitation wage suddenly showing up with real money from nowhere would have been the single fastest way to hand Park exactly the confirmation he was fishing for. Sasha put it more bluntly when I told her that night. If I so much as bought a decent meal on a card that shouldn't have covered it, I'd be doing Park's entire investigation for him free of charge. I liquidated what I could between shifts that week, careful and quiet, mostly low-value scrap that wouldn't draw attention if anyone bothered checking a sanitation worker's habits. And even that modest trickle added up faster than I expected once I stopped second-guessing every small find. Sasha ran the masked job solo for 3 of those nights, insisting I was too distracted watching for anyone connecting the freeze to the dungeon logs to be reliable backup, and I didn't argue the point even once, which by itself told me how correct she probably was. She let me tag along on the 4th, on the condition I stayed at the entrance ward and did nothing but watch. A mid-tier construct broke off from the pack she was drawing away and came straight at the doorway where I was standing, and I dropped it in a single hit without meaning to prove anything to anyone, purely reflex, my new stat totals answering a threat before my own conscious judgment had finished registering it as one. Sasha didn't say anything about it afterward. She didn't need to. Liquidated, assorted scrap, bulk, to plus 2,000 billion bronze. Level, 76 to 82. Strength, 76 to 82. Vitality, 76 to 82. Perception, 76 to 82. Gold, 700 million. Hidden, 700 million. Sitting exactly where Park would never think to look, while my actual, official, on-the-books balance stayed frozen at a number that couldn't have bought me a decent meal. That was the part that actually stung. Not the freeze itself, which cost me nothing real, but what maintaining the cover required me to do about it in front of the one person who'd never once treated me as a joke. I found Hyrie during her end-of-shift rounds and asked, as evenly as I could manage, whether she could front me alone until the account review cleared. She studied my face for a moment first, the way she studied a requisition form she suspected had an error buried somewhere in it, before asking, not quite a question, whether I was actually asking her for money. I told her the account freeze had come out of nowhere, and I needed to cover rent until it sorted itself out. Both true, technically, in the narrowest possible reading of the words, and both leaving out the one detail that would have actually explained everything. She didn't ask why a man everyone in this building already called broke needed help covering rent specifically now, 3 weeks after a story had started going around about a masked hunter nobody could identify. She just went to the drawer where she kept her own modest savings, counted out more than I'd actually asked for, and told me to pay her back whenever the review cleared, no rush, the same way she'd have said it to anyone on her crew who'd ever come to her genuinely short. She'd done this before, I realized, watching her count the bills without a second thought, for other sanitation workers who'd never once had the luxury of a hidden fortune to fall back on. This was just what she did, quietly, on her own modest salary, for anyone on her crew who came to her genuinely short and had nowhere else to turn. I'd watched her do it for other people a dozen times over 3 years without ever once connecting it to my own situation, because it had never once been my situation before tonight. I was only now noticing the pattern because, for the first time since she'd known me, I actually needed it too. I took the money. 700 million gold sat 2 districts over, completely untouched, while I stood in a sanitation supervisor's office accepting charity from a woman who made less in a year than I'd made in the last single afternoon, and neither of us said a single word about how badly that math didn't add up.